Xueqi's Martial Arts Saga. Chapter 26-37. Bas, bas, bas. In the distant horizon, at the end of the starry sky, dozens of balls buzzed again. Pushed by 100,000 cultivators, they rained down on the disciples of the bright sword sect like meteors. Not only were Ji Ming and the other Grade 1 and Grade 2 illusory swordsmen shocked. Even Xueqi, who had transformed into a sword, groaned inwardly. He knew very well that he could only withstand one more attack. After that, he wouldn't be able to maintain his human form. My life is over. Xueqi couldn't help but feel disheartened. He felt that he really couldn't face the dozens of balls that seemed capable of destroying heaven and earth. Not far from the Sky Exterminating Formation was the Wind Exterminating Formation. At this moment, the flag gate of the Wind Exterminating Formation was emitting a gloomy brilliance. After bright young sword sect's Xueqi led over 10,000 disciples into the formation, the flag gate should have been closed tightly. The brilliance was even dimmed, and the flag gate was covered by the dense fog in the surroundings. Only when all the swordsmen were killed would the flag gate be revealed again. Of course, if Xueqi destroyed the Wind Destroyer Formation, the blood-red lantern on the pole in front of the gate would have been extinguished. Not only would the gate be opened again, but the fog would have also disappeared. However, the 10-direction destroyer formation had just been restored, and its foundation was still damaged. Xiong Huasong couldn't fix these flaws yet. Fortunately, there weren't too many flaws in the 10 gates of the 10-direction destroyer formation. Just look at the Wind Destroyer Formation. Reddish-yellow hurricanes wreaked havoc in the formation. The hurricanes were like sharp blades. Not only did they cut through the swordsmen's sword lights, but they also completely dispersed the sword chi of the flying swords. Even the cold wind that passed through the swordsmen's sword lights and blew into their bodies, causing them to stiffen. Even when they activated their sword origin, the situation didn't improve at all. Like Xueqi and LV Ruocheng, Xueqi had already transformed into a sword. Beside him, several Grade 1 and Grade 2 illusory swordsmen had also transformed into swords. On top of the giant sword that Xueqi transformed into, the sword radiance that was like a cold moon exuded a gloomy coldness. The swords that were formed by the swordsmen clustered around him also had sword radiances that were as hot as the sun. They also temporarily formed a simple sword formation within the formation. The sword radiances of different attributes interweaved with each other, trying their best to resist the bone-chilling yellow wind. There was no scenery around Xueqi and the other cultivators. There was only chaos stirred up by countless wind tunnels. The chaos was like sticky mud, sealing off the entire formation. It was as if there was no more spiritual energy of heaven and earth, other than the countless hurricanes. Hum. It was extremely soft. A sound came from a certain wind tunnel in the primal chaos, and a faint yellow light appeared at the bottom of the wind tunnel. Then, the yellow light spun violently, and a gentle wind appeared at the bottom of the wind tunnel. This breeze spun along the edges of the wind tunnel, becoming faster and stronger. By the time it blew out of the wind tunnel, it had already formed a huge reddish-yellow wind blade. It was like a huge wind vortex, blowing towards the tens of thousands of bright young sword sect disciples. At the same time, the wind tunnel was torn apart by the hurricane. Presumably, the next hurricane would definitely be stronger than this one. Not to mention the following hurricane, this roaring hurricane fell precisely where Xueqi and the others could not care less. The reddish-yellow wind blade destroyed the flying swords of more than 10 sword-nurturing swords and drawing swords. When the brilliance of the flying swords was destroyed, the flying swords' bodies rapidly rusted. Not long after, they were broken into several pieces and thrown into the air. What made the swordsmen tremble with fear the most was that the flying swords who had lost their flying swords did not even have time to spit out their life origin swords before the yellow wind blew straight through their bodies. After all the flying swords were scraped into pieces by the hurricane, pieces of flesh were also torn off their bodies at an extremely fast speed. In fact, before the 2 sword-nurturing swords could even scream, all their flesh was scraped off, leaving behind only white bones. Buzz! It was as if the entire world was shaking. In mid-air, the numerous wind tunnels flashed with a faint yellow brilliance at almost the same time. Hundreds, thousands of wind strands were gradually produced in the wind tunnels. At this moment, there was a temporary silence in the entire battle. But then, all the wind tunnels began to shake, and the chaos began to churn again. Thousands of hurricanes tore through the wind tunnels and flew out again. The entire wind extinguishing formation was no longer able to see any brilliance. Even the brilliance of the giant swords was covered in the hurricane. My life is over. Xueqi saw that the hurricane had not yet arrived, but the connection between the giant swords that he had transformed into and the surrounding swords had been cut off by the power of the hurricane. He could not help but sigh like Xueqi. The yellow wind in the wind-extinguishing formation was so magical that it caused Xueqi's heart to turn to ashes. He felt that what he was facing was the most powerful magic formation in the 10 Forces Annihilation formation. However, he did not know that on the opposite side of the wind-extinguishing array, behind the blood-colored flag gate, in the middle of a sea of blood, the flame bamboo sword sex Tian Simu's face was even more ashen. She looked in disbelief at the blood-red color that was surging towards her from all sides. That's right. Tian Simu led several disciples of the illusory sword sect, or more than 10,000 disciples of the bright sword sect and the nurturing sword sect, into the strange blood-red fog. She wanted to find out what kind of magic formation this was, and perhaps find a way to break it from its name. Unfortunately, these swordsmen had just charged into the array. Before they could even see the cultivator's face, they only felt a burst of bright red light flashing from the horizon. Then, their ears were filled with the sound of waves. Soon after, the red water that seemed like the legendary Nether Blood Sea surrounded the 10,000 swordsmen with an earth-shattering force. Set up the magic formation. Set up the magic formation. A first-grade illusory sword sect disciple beside Tian Simu shouted almost without thinking, gathering the 10,000 swordsmen together in panic. They hurriedly urged the flying swords under their feet to set up dozens of simple sword formations. Under the urging of the sword origin, Xueqi rushed out of the flying swords. The sword light was like thousands of colorful ribbons that pierced into the blood sea. Hiss, 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 countless ear-piercing sounds of melting were heard, as if thousands of flames were extinguished by ice water. The Xueqi rushed into the blood sea, only to create a small whirlpool. The sword light was completely corroded by the blood sea. Splash, with the sound of water, a huge blood wave that was several feet tall surged. Like a giant hand, it slammed into the sword formation formed by the 10 sword-nurturing swordsmen. The 10 swordsmen's faces changed greatly. They desperately urged the true essence in their bodies, and the sword light was faintly shining. However, this brilliance only lasted for a moment. It was like the splendor of a candle in the chilly wind. With a sizzling sound, the blood wave slammed down. The thin sword light was quickly corroded by the blood wave, and the flying swords were stained with the blood wave. Circles and spots of corrosion appeared on the flying swords. As if they were burned by a raging fire, the 10 swordsmen's divine senses were severely damaged. They couldn't help but cry out. However, this was just the beginning. After the blood wave splashed onto the flying swords, it seemed to have a mind of its own and splashed onto the swordsmen's bodies. The sword light around the swordsmen flickered slightly and was corroded by the blood wave. It was much easier than destroying the flying swords. When the swordsman's sword light faded away, the swordsmen were about to activate their sword origin again. With an extremely soft swoosh, the blood immediately turned into balls of blood and rushed into the swordsmen's bodies again. Help! Many of the swordsmen were in unbearable pain and couldn't help but scream. Before their screams faded, small pieces of flesh fell off their bodies. Following the disappearance of these pieces of flesh, the threads of blood were like a spider weaving a spider's web on the swordsmen's bodies, rapidly spreading once again. The result was, the swordsmen fell from the sky with wounds all over their bodies. What greeted them was the same endless blood wave. Shameless cultivators. After Tian Simu recovered from her shock, she was furious. She knew that the cultivators guarding the array wouldn't meet with her. Hence, she roared and the sword wave around her body flew wildly. A silver-white sword essence that was as bright as the moon shot out from her body. Although it had been stained red by the blood wave, the sword essence was still crystal clear. Clang! A blood-red sword cry resounded. The silver-colored sword essence gradually enlarged and wrapped around Tian Simu. A huge flying sword was born in the blood wave. Tian Simu had no choice but to transform into a sword. Disciple is here to assist martial uncle. Several second-grade illusory swordsmen shouted. They also strengthened their swords and stood to the left and right of Tian Simu's huge sword. Clang! A series of sword cries rose and fell. The flying swords that were resisting the blood wave let out sword cries. Following the cries, all the flying swords shone brightly. Furthermore, all the flying swords trembled along with Tian Simu's huge sword. The dozens of sword-nurturing swordsmen who were about to die after the sword-nurturing swordsmen were temporarily protected by the powerful sword essence, blocking the blood wave outside of the sword chi. Watch this sword's methods. The sound of Tian Simu's golden chime could be heard from the huge sword. It seemed to be moving slowly, but in reality, it was extremely fast. The huge sword, together with the flying swords of several second-grade illusory sword disciples, as well as the flying swords of thousands of other disciples, slashed towards the blood sea. Rumble. The huge sword slashed into the blood wave like water being cut off. The blood wave splashed up hundreds of feet high. Furthermore, the sword force of the huge sword did not stop and slashed deep into the bottom of the blood wave. Under the sword essence of the huge sword, a crack that was dozens of feet deep and dozens of feet wide was opened up in the surging blood wave. At the bottom of the crack, an even more blood-red brilliance could be seen. Under the brilliance, Xueqi School's Gao Wei, Mo Sangshan, and Qing Zhiyong each held a banner in their hands. Their faces carried a trace of astonishment as they looked at the huge sword that had slashed into the brilliance. Hee, I didn't expect the nameless flame bamboo sword sect to have such a powerful sword technique. Xueqi School's Gao Wei, who had lost many golden core disciples to the swordsman, smirked coldly after recovering from his astonishment. He turned to look at Qing Zhiyong and said, I will activate it now. Chapter 26:38. Yes. Qing Zhiyong nodded slightly and replied. The banner in his hand emitted a faint blood-red light. Together with the blood-red light from the banner in Gao Wei's hand, they shot towards the defensive brilliance. The brilliance swayed slightly and blocked the giant sword that Tian Simu had transformed into. Some of the blood-red light even penetrated the brilliance and rushed into the blood sea. Oh no! Tian Simu immediately felt that something was wrong. However, just as this thought appeared in his mind, he saw the blood sea that he and the thousands of flying swords had split apart earlier, once again rushing down like a mountain. Tian Simu hurriedly urged the sword light, wanting to block the blood sea. Unfortunately, the attack power of the giant sword that was comparable to that of the early Yuanying stage was really weak in terms of defense. The huge blood sea, along with the resentment that had just been stirred up, fiercely smashed into the sword light of the defense swordsman. Ah! A series of screams sounded. The sword light that protected the defense swordsman was extremely easily shattered by the blood sea. Hundreds of defense swordsmen screamed and were swept away by the blood sea. What should we do? Tian Simu had only just seen Gao Wei and the others, but he was already thinking anxiously. Indeed, the blood-extinguishing formation in the 10 Forces Annihilation battle was not an ordinary attack technique. The flying swords that the sword cultivators could rely on were simply unable to break through the blood sea. Tian Simu was even more anxious than Lu Ruochang and the others. However, he was far from being the most anxious. Looking at the blood-extinguishing formation, there were balls of Samadhi true fire all around. Although the Samadhi true fire was not extremely pure and was mixed with many orange-red, orange-yellow and other colors, this Samadhi true fire was not something that the flying swords of the sword cultivators could destroy. Between the heavens and the earth, there was the trial of the flames. Although the various colored sword lights in the flames attacked, once the sword lights came into contact with the flames, they were immediately ignited. The Samadhi true fire swallowed along the sword lights and rushed towards the flying swords. A thin sword that looked like a beauty emitted a dark green sword light and forced the Samadhi true fire 1,000 feet away. This thin sword was the giant sword that Ruo Ling of Failing Sword Manor transformed into. The giant sword that Ruo Ling had transformed into was able to cover the true Samadhi fire, but it was unable to completely suppress it. The surging flames were almost tangible, wreaking havoc around the brilliance of the giant sword like waves of the sea. Beside the huge dark green sword, there were also several flying swords transformed by swordsmen at the second grade of the illusory sword realm. It was obvious that although their sword light could repel the Samadhi true fire, there were also traces of the Samadhi true fire spreading on the sword light. Needless to say, the true Samadhi fire was not something they could easily withstand, especially this sea of fire. Hundreds of disciples had their defenses broken through by the true Samadhi fire, burning their bodies. Furthermore, the Samadhi true fire was extremely aggressive. Any swordsman who was burned by the Samadhi true fire would be turned into ashes, leaving no trace behind. The light that flashed intensely on the jade sword was Ruo Ling's thoughts. When she was comforting LV Ruochang earlier, she did not think much of LV Ruochang's fear. However, now that she had encountered the true formation of the Dao sect, she could not help but feel a little terrified. She had been surrounded by the sea of fire the moment she entered the sword formation. She did not even know who her opponent was from the Dao sect. At this moment, she also had the thought of retreating. Her sword intent swept past the sea of fire and swept towards the flag gate. The formation of earthly annihilation was something that Hung Hang had explained to Su Jie of the Rock Border sect that day. The formation of earthly annihilation is ever-changing and full of doubts. It is hidden within the mysteries of the formation, with thunder above and fire below and emotionless. Even with the 5 elements flying sword technique, it is difficult to escape the gloomy clouds of bones. This formation is based on the number of the Dao sect, so it is called earthly annihilation. This praise for the formation of earthly annihilation was a little exaggerated. Not to mention that it was impossible for the formation of earthly annihilation to have too many changes and form the Dao sect, it was also impossible for it to form the Dao sect. If one were to say that it was full of doubts, it could still be arranged a little more. However, since this formation of earthly annihilation was personally presided over by the Black Sky sect's Xiong Song, it naturally had a different atmosphere. The one who charged into the formation of earthly annihilation was Mu Ting of the Lunar Sword sect. She was a 3rd-grade illusory swordsman, and her cultivation could be counted on one hand among the many sword sections. However, even with this level of cultivation, even if Mu Ting had transformed into a sword, and even if several 2nd-grade illusory swordsmen had transformed into swords at the same time, and nearly 10,000 disciples had formed a sword formation to resist, the situation was still precarious. The entire formation of earthly annihilation was filled with biting cold wind. The wisps of fog could not be blown away by the cold wind, and it blocked the gazes of all the sword cultivators. In the cold wind, the sword light around the sword cultivators flickered, and they were like candles in the wind. The situation was somewhat similar to the wind annihilation formation. However, this was not the most important killing move of the formation of earthly annihilation. The most powerful part of the formation of earthly annihilation was the ground beneath the sword cultivators. The dark, thick, solid earth that was as hard as gold and stone. Clearly, the ground was not the ordinary ground of the sword tomb. At this time, the ground had long been split into countless pieces, and the huge cracks were like bloody mouths that had opened up on the ground. The countless cracks were rapidly opening up and closing up, and the countless pieces of land were constantly shaking up and down, rubbing against each other left and right, and creating loud rumbling sounds. Waves of cold wind blew out from the rumbling sounds, and from the countless cracks. It was like the ghostly wind in the underworld. The ghostly wind was so biting cold, the earth shook, and the cracks were so ruthless. Although the huge sword transformed by Mu Ting and the others split the ground into pieces, the fragments opened their bloody mouths and kept swallowing the sword cultivators. The sword chi of the sword-nurturing sword and the sword-drawing sword could not destroy these fragments, but their sword light was squeezed and smashed by the tremors of the earth. Hundreds and thousands of swordsmen fell in this doomsday-like formation of earthly annihilation. Their corpses fell into the cracks of the earth, and with just a simple friction, they were immediately turned into meat paste. Blood was smeared in the cracks, and one could see the bloodiness and power of the formation of earthly annihilation. The Earth Extermination Formation sounded similar to the Earth Extermination Formation, but within the Earth Extermination Formation, there was a vast expanse of gray sand. The sand floated in the space of the Earth Extermination Formation, blocking the swordsman's vision. Even if the swordsman could release his divine sense, he would still be injured by the sand. The grains of sand were like the swordsman's sword light, densely packed and extremely sharp as they collided with the swordsman's defense. Except for the swordsman from the flowing sword sect, the huge sword transformed by the illusory sword grade 2 swordsman was barely holding on in the sand. Even the other illusory sword grade 1 swordsmen were in imminent danger in the sand. The various sword lights did not differentiate between attributes and sword intent in the sand, and they were all suppressed by the sand. They were constantly eroded by the sand, and the sword origin in their bodies poured out, trying to maintain this only barrier. As for those disciples with shallow cultivation, once their sword light was defeated by the sand, their flesh would immediately fester, and an indescribable itch would drill into their hearts. They could not help but claw at the sand, and the flesh on their hands would also fester. Pus and white bones gradually appeared, and the heart-wrenching scream seemed extremely small and helpless in this raging sand. Different from the formation of earthly annihilation, the formation of earthly annihilation was a piece of azure blue. It was unknown where the light came from, but when the light passed through the formation, countless small, scale-like crystals were reflected in the formation. The countless crystals flashed with azure blue brilliance, and the entire formation was like a world carved out of ice. However, this world of ice was extremely cold. Compared to the extreme north, It was even more austere. Chu Jianchong of the Xian sword sect had already transformed into a sword, and the scarlet flame on the sword light turned into a flame, as if it was going to burn the sky. However, the flame was only hot at the beginning, and it burned away the ice near it. In the blink of an eye, the azure blue light near the giant sword trembled rapidly, as if it was supported by an endless amount of mana. The cold actually froze the flame, and after the sword light appeared in the flame, it froze there, as if it could not move. Zang! As the giant sword trembled, a sword hum sounded. The sword light flashed, and when the sword chi scattered, it only shook the ice near it. However, it was immediately hit by the cold wave, and it froze again. Chu Jianchong, who had transformed into a giant sword, felt an unparalleled surge of mana in the cold wave, and naturally knew that this was the condensation of the mana of tens of thousands of Dao sect cultivators. Coupled with the power of the formation, he, a grade 2 illusory swordsman, could not block it. Perhaps. I have to make a choice. Chu Jianchong's divine sense scanned the entire formation that seemed to be sealed in ice. Almost 1,000 disciples had died in this formation. Not only were their bodies frozen into popsicles, even their souls were about to be frozen to death. He couldn't help but think to himself. Inside the most mysterious soul obliteration array, it was somewhat similar to the earth obliteration array and the wind obliteration array. The entire world was gloomy, and chilly winds blew. There was no sign of life. Even the illusionary mountain rocks were dark green and grayish-black, just like the legendary hell. The one who charged into the soul-extinguishing formation was the Quilted Mountain Sect's Song Yuan, a grade 3 illusory sword beast cultivator. At this moment, Song Yuan was standing in the air like a stone chiseled from earth, and he didn't move at all. To his left in the sky, a black mass of bird cultivators flew slowly. As their wings flapped, the spiritual energy of heaven and earth dissipated. Behind him, there were thousands of beast cultivators who stood quietly. Although there was no surge of mana, their intimidating aura filled the entire formation. Everyone's gaze was focused in front of them. There was a white banner in the hands of a cultivator. This cultivator was none other than Kunlun Sect's Yuan Zhongyu, who had been ordered to preside over the soul-extinguishing formation. On the other side of the banner was Nanming Sect's Liang Mingfu. At this moment, both of them had solemn expressions, and their nervousness was no less than Song Yuan's. Chapter 26:39. He moved. Song Yuan, who had been motionless all this time, suddenly moved. It was as if the entire formation had come to life, and the energy was flowing out from where Song Yuan stood. Ha ha ha! I thought it was some kind of formation. So it's something similar to the millions of soul cultivators in Meng Mountains. Song Yuan moved a little, dispelling all the terror that had condensed within 1,000 feet. He laughed loudly and said, "Your Dao sect is really funny. Instead of using a good array formation, you set up some bullshit soul cultivation array formation. Do you know what a soul cultivator is? Do you know how to use a soul tool? Do you know what a real soul formation looks like?" When Yuan Zhongyu heard this, he raised his eyebrows and his eyes involuntarily turned to Liang Mingfu. The two of them had only been in charge of the formation for a short period of time, so they were not familiar with it. It was not as convenient as the other gold core cultivators in the meeting hall. Even the tens of thousands of disciples hidden in the formation were scratching their heads at the incantations used to activate the formation. Although they were in position and the soul obliteration formation was set up, Yuan Zhongyu's flagpole was abnormally difficult to wave, and he would occasionally feel the backlash of his magic power. Clearly, there was a problem with the tens of thousands of disciples transmitting their magic power, and there was also a problem with Yuan Zhongyu's incantation. Liang Mingfu saw the look in Yuan Zhongyu's eyes and shook his head helplessly. He was only a cultivator of the Nanming sect, and the sect's name had the word Ming in it. However, he had nothing to do with soul cultivators, so he didn't know anything about spells related to the soul. Song Yuan's words hit the nail on the head and hit the nail on the head. Perhaps we can only buy some time. When Yuan Zhongyu saw Liang Mingfu shaking his head, he groaned inwardly. He knew that the 10 Forces Annihilation Formation was an ancient formation that was linked to each other. As long as one of the 10 formations was destroyed, even if the other 9 formations were not destroyed, the swordsman would still be able to escape from the formation. However, if all 10 formations were not destroyed, then they were a whole. The difficulty of destroying one of the formations was far greater than destroying one of the individual formations. What's wrong? Are you scared? Yuan Zhongyu sneered, waved the banner slightly and said, "The magic of Dao sect originated from the ancient times. How could it be compared to those uncivilized barbarians in Meng Mountains? If you don't want to become a vengeful spirit under this old man's banner, why don't you descend from the cloud and let this old man tie you up? This old man can guarantee with my life that I will not let you fall here. And even what? Can you still make me a disciple of your Kunlun sect?" Song Yuan curled his lips and asked coldly. "If you want to, it's not impossible. Now that I have the Kunlun sect master's token, I can accept you into my Kunlun sect as my senior martial brother." Yuan Zhongyu's eyes flashed with a hint of joy as he hurriedly explained. "Pooey." Song Yuan spat out his phlegm the moment he opened his mouth. When he saw the phlegm fly out in an arc, Song Yuan laughed out loud. "A small Dao sect that hides evil actually wants to accept me as a disciple? This is the funniest thing I've ever seen in my life." "You don't know," Yuan Vongyu hurriedly said. "My Kunlun sect is the most ancient cultivation sect on the Xiaoyu continent. Our specific orthodoxy can only be traced back to the primordial era." Primordial era? The primordial era is bullshit. Song Yuan opened his mouth wide and shouted. "The so-called primordial era is nothing but a legend that Dao sect cultivators like you forcefully made up in order to hide your origins. With this primordial era, you can say that we sword cultivators are barbarians and belong to an unorthodox sect. Who doesn't know of such methods?" A bitter smile appeared on Yuan Zhongyu's face. He shook his head slightly and said, "Song Yuan, haven't you thought about it? Where did the cultivation method that we cultivate come from? Where did the magic tools and treasures that we use come from? If there were no ancestors from the primordial era, how would we know that there is a path of cultivation in this world?" He. Then let this old man ask you, what was the primordial era like? Was it the current state of the Xiaoyu continent? Where did the cultivators of the primordial era go? The immortal world? Why didn't they come back to take a look? Song Yuan's eyes flashed with a trace of understanding as he asked loudly. "In the ancient records of my Kunlun sect, during the primordial era, the world was vast, the mountains were infinitely high, and the abyss was infinitely deep. Even the cultivators." At this point, Yuan Zhongyu himself was stunned. That's right, the ancient records recorded a scene of the primordial era. The cultivators were like giants, the mountains reached the sky, and the oceans penetrated the earth. It was completely different from the Xiaoyu continent. "What do you mean?" Song Yuan sneered. "You can't make it up anymore, right? Do you think that your Kunlun sect seniors are just making things up? If the primordial era's almighty cultivators had exceedingly high cultivation and longevity, why can't they be seen now?" Yuan Zhongyu argued. "The various almighty naturally entered the immortal world. The immortal world is connected to our Xiaoyu continent through a passage. However, this passage can only lead from the Xiaoyu continent to the immortal world. It can't lead to the Xiaoyu continent from the immortal world, so they can't come back." That's even more nonsense. The roads in this world are free to come and go. If you can come, you can leave. This daddy has never heard of a road that can only come and not go. Song Yuan waved his hand indifferently. "You've set up a formation here today. Why are you talking about the primordial era with this daddy for no reason? Is it because you can't control this formation related to soul cultivation?" Yuan Zhongyu's heart skipped a beat when Song Yuan saw through his thoughts. He thought to himself, this big and burly beast cultivator is actually so sharp. He's indeed different from the legends. However, he still joked, there are 3,000 great Daos, and each Dao leads to God. Let this old man ask you, you're cultivating. What is it for? For what? Song Yuan frowned as if he had an extremely difficult question to answer. However, Yuan Zhongyu was delighted and asked again, is it not for longevity? The confusion in Song Yuan's eyes grew stronger. Heh. Yuan Zhongyu was slightly pleased with himself. He said, actually, when this old man was young, I had a dream, however, before he could finish speaking. He heard Song Yuan raise his hand into the air and laugh loudly. Ha. The purpose of this daddy's cultivation is to kill all the cultivators of the Dao sect. As he spoke, the brown light around Song Yuan's body grew stronger. Song Yuan's originally big body was now beating his chest with his hands. The light around his body grew bigger and bigger, and the solidified spiritual energy of heaven and earth in the surroundings suddenly began to move. Roar. When the beast cultivators near Songyuan saw this, they all raised their heads and roared. Following the flashes of various colors, the beast cultivators' bodies gradually disappeared. Their ferocious beast heads and terrifying beast bodies began to reveal themselves. Even Songyuan revealed the shell of a giant ape. The giant ape was about 100 feet tall, and its pitch-black body hair was like steel needles piercing into the giant ape's mountain-like body. Even under the black hair, there were wisps of black light and wisps of black chi lingering around it. It looked extremely strange. At this moment, the giant ape's head was over 10 feet in size. Its lantern-like eyes flickered with a crimson brilliance. Apart from bloodthirstiness, there was also a ferocious savagery. All the emotions in Songyuan's eyes had disappeared. Roar! The giant ape roared again. In its bloody mouth, 2 sharp fangs shone like flying swords. Following the giant ape's roar, a gush of spiritual energy of heaven and earth poured into the giant ape's mouth. Following that, the giant ape pounded its chest with its huge fists, producing the sound of a golden drum beating. When did beast cultivators learn to lie? Yuan Zhongyu stared at Songyuan's beast form with his mouth agape. He could not help but cry out, "Isn't such a huge Dharma body born from the primordial age? How dare you say that you don't believe in the primordial age?" However, before Yuan Zhongyu could finish his groan, the huge ape stuck its head out and blew a gust of wind from its mouth. That gust of wind was mixed with a foul stench as it rushed towards Yuan Zhongyu and Liang Mingfu. Disgusting! Yuan Zhongyu's mouth was filled with acid. He waved his hand, and an earthy yellow shield fell about 10 feet in front of him, as if to block the gust of wind. Swoosh swoosh! A burst of raindrops fell on the shield. Following that, the shield made a piercing sound, and tiny cracks appeared on the shield. This is bad. Is this guy so powerful? This was completely out of Yuan Zhongyu's expectations. He did not dare to be negligent. He hurriedly shook his hand again, and a dozen rays of light flashed out. One shield after another appeared in front of him. However, Yuan Zhongyu was still a little too late. The first shield shattered into pieces with a crash, and a disgusting stench rushed toward Yuan Zhongyu and Liang Mingfu. Even the raindrops formed by the saliva dripped onto Yuan Zhongyu's head. Although the saliva was not threatening, being bullied by someone else's saliva on the head of a mid-stage golden core cultivator was the same as being slapped in the face by a secular person. Yuan Zhongyu was finally angry. He could no longer suppress the murderous intent that he had been concealing. His eyes narrowed, and the brilliance around his body flashed. He was about to make a move, however, before the Dhamma power around his body surged. The giant ape in the distance had already made its move. The giant ape was in mid-air, waving its arms and rushing toward Yuan Zhongyu and Liang Mingfu. Its big feet stepped in mid-air, as if it was stepping on the ground. Dong dong, sound shook the whole array. The violent tremors came from the giant ape's mountain-like body, and the spiritual energy in the air was stirred up. It was as if the whole array was trembling with the giant ape. An indescribable suffocating feeling slowly rose around Yuan Zhongyu and Liang Mingfu as the huge ape approached, filling up the space within 100 feet around them. Fellow Taoist Yuan. Liang Mingfu's chest uncontrollably heaved up and down, as if he could not breathe. He hurriedly shouted, "There's no time to lose, let's take out the gate of life and death." Chapter 2640. Seeing the power of the giant ape, Yuan Zhongyu was also shocked. What kind of magical power was this? It actually caused the entire array to shake. Looking at the head of the giant ape, 2,000 to 3,000 beast cultivators also showed ferocious expressions. They flapped their wings and flew towards them. Behind the giant ape, thousands of beast cultivators chased after them, waving flags and shouting. They seemed to want to trample Yuan Zhongyu and Liang Mingfu into meat paste with just their bare hands. That's the only way. Yuan Zhongyu was a little helpless. He made a mysterious gesture and pinched the bottom of the flag. At the same time, the spiritual power in his body gushed out. When a dark green light covered the flag, the veins on Yuan Zhongyu's face bulged. He shouted, "Fellow Taoist Liang, help me!" Liang Mingfu knew that Yuan Zhongyu was being forced to do something beyond his ability. He really didn't know what to do, so he hurriedly stepped forward and made a strange gesture. As the gesture was produced, a purple-black ball of light appeared in his hand. Go! As Liang Mingfu made the gesture, the ball of light fell on the flag. Swish, with a clear sound, the whole flag flashed with black and white brilliance. A faintly discernible door appeared on the flag. It was like a rainbow bridge spanning across the array. Disciples, listen to my order. After Yuan Zhongyu and Liang Mingfu made the gesture, their faces turned slightly pale. They both shouted, "Activate the gate of life and death." Bas! A violent vibration came from the black and white door, and the whole door gradually expanded. The black and white brilliance on the door circulated at an extremely fast speed, and in an instant, it showed a strange gray color. Within the gray, countless tiny bubbles were bubbling like boiling water. Within those tiny bubbles, the shapes of ghost faces seemed to be faintly protruding. Furthermore, each time these ghost faces protruded, their appearance was different. It was as if countless ghost faces were trying their best to rush out of those bubbles. However, this buzzing sound was extremely weak among the vibrations of the giant ape, the cries of the beast cultivators, and the roars of the beast cultivators. No one could hear it clearly. If it wasn't for the fact that the gray door had grown bigger and covered the entire array, blocking all the beast and bird cultivators, they wouldn't have noticed it at all. However, as the giant ape ran, it stirred up the spirit chi of heaven and earth. A casual grab from its palms, which were dozens of feet long, created a hurricane. How could Song Yuan care about this door that looked like it would shatter with a single slap? Caw! Among the beast cultivators, there were a few beasts that looked like eagles and vultures flying in front of them. They were now close to the gray door, and the slight ripples from the door made them tremble in fear. They couldn't help but cry out as if they were asking the giant ape for permission. At this moment, the giant ape's eyes were crimson red, and the muscles on his arms that were like hills were faintly trembling. He had already clenched his huge fists and was about to rush to the door and smash it into pieces. How could he have the heart to answer the bird cultivator's question? Roar! The giant ape raised its head and spat out a huge stream of air, causing the beast cultivators flying at the back to tumble a few times and almost fall from the sky. How could the beast cultivators at the front dare to ask any more questions? Each of them took out different demonic artifacts, and some even charged toward the gray door with bare arms. Close the life door, open the death door. When the white banner is unfurled, it's eerie and gloomy. I've never believed in the sword cultivator's body. Once you enter the array, your life will return to the Yin. Behind the door, Yuan Zhongyu's pale face was slightly flushed. His body was trembling slightly as he proudly chanted. Boom! There was a loud sound, as if a huge rock had been thrown into a pool of water. Several beast cultivators at the first grade of the illusory sword realm brandished all kinds of pitch-black demonic artifacts and charged into the gray door. At the same time, the gray brilliance on the door flashed violently. In an instant, the gray color was absorbed into the brilliance on all four sides of the door. The entire door became transparent again, as if there was nothing there at all. However, it was this strange transparency that caused the beast cultivators to fall from the sky without any warning after they charged through. They didn't even have time to scream. Caw! After these beast cultivators, there were still more than 1,000 flying beasts. The dozens at the front couldn't stop at all. Although they flapped their wings rapidly in an attempt to stop, there were still some who mustered all their strength to fly up and avoid the door. However, their fates were not unexpected. The dozens of beast cultivators charged into the gray brilliance and fell from the sky. Roar! Just as the other beast cultivators were trying their best to stabilize their bodies, the giant ape had already charged under the gray door. The giant ape was more than 100 feet tall, and the door was also more than 100 feet tall. After the image of the door flashed in the giant ape's red eyes, the giant ape didn't stop at all. It waved its fists and smashed towards the middle of the door. Rumble! That sound was actually similar to the sound of magical treasures colliding. It was precisely at the moment when the giant ape's fist rushed through the transparent door. Above the gray door, there was even a strong flash of light. This flash was initially gray, but towards the end, it actually showed two colors, black and white. Not good. Yuan Zhongyu was shocked. Without waiting for Liang Mingfu to remind him, he urged the magical power around his body. While the brilliance on his body flashed, he also tried his best to wave the banner. Liang Mingfu was also shocked. While transmitting his voice in a certain direction, he also hurriedly performed a spell. A powerful magical power fluctuation was generated from the space behind the two of them. It was similar to the fluctuation of the door of life and death. When the fluctuation fell on the door of life and death, the black and white brilliance flickered again, and the gray light trembled again. Roar! At this time, when the giant ape's body rushed into a small part of the door of life and death, an irresistible fear arose in Song Yuan's heart. On the part of his body that rushed into the door of life and death, the needle-like mane softened and danced in the wind. The black light and black fog in the black hair also disappeared at this time, leaving only the gray brilliance flashing in the black hair. Song Yuan knew very well that this gray door should be the core of the formation. He only needed to break this door, and the formation would be broken. But obviously, if he went through this door, even he, who was a third-grade illusory sword, couldn't predict the consequences. Roar, at this time, how could Song Yuan have the luxury of retreating? He raised his head and roared angrily, then rushed toward the edge of the door. Following Song Yuan into the door of life and death, there were naturally a few first-grade illusory sword beast cultivators behind him. Behind these beast cultivators were thousands of drawing swords and pregnant swords cultivators. Swish, a first-grade illusory sword beast cultivator rushed into the door. Similar to the bird cultivator who died before, he didn't have any resistance at all and fell from the sky like a hard stone. Then, more than 10 beast cultivators rushed into the door and died. There was no other outcome. Woo! At this time, Song Yuan had already rushed to the edge of the door of life and death. His hands were extremely barbaric as he tore at the door. The gray brilliance of the door of life and death seemed to be solid in Song Yuan's hands. With a casual pull, it was pulled up several feet high. However, at this time, under the strong fluctuation of the door, the gray brilliance was bright and dim, as if it would break at any time. Yet, when Song Yuan pulled it a few times, the gray brilliance tenaciously overflowed. Roar! The great ape roared loudly. It gave up on destroying the door and rushed toward Yuan Zhongyu and Liang Mingfu who were behind the door. Yuan Zhongyu and Liang Mingfu saw the great ape rushing into the door of life and death. Although there was a gray brilliance flashing around its body, Song Yuan continued to rush forward as if nothing had happened. They couldn't help but feel bitter. They knew that the door of life and death was not a threat to the great ape, who was a third-grade illusory sword cultivator. However, what could they do? While urging their magic power, the two of them looked at each other and were about to summon their magic treasures. Although the two of them were already cultivators at the middle stage of Gold Core and had already entered the meeting hall of Sky Patrol City, if they were to control their magic treasures and the banner of the Soul Destroyer formation at the same time, they might not be able to do it smoothly. However, just as the two of them were in a dilemma, they saw the great ape's body suddenly slow down. Its footsteps seemed to have fallen into a quagmire, and it was rather sloppy. Even Song Yuan's eyes were filled with confusion and disbelief. After running for a few more steps, the great ape finally did not dare to move forward. It raised its eyes and looked at the gray door that had expanded greatly. It then looked at Yuan Zhongyu who was in the distance, and there was a trace of unwillingness in its eyes. Immediately, this unwillingness turned into the intention to retreat. Song Yuan finally could not withstand the power of the door of life and death and hurriedly rushed out of the door. Of course, at this moment, more than 10 beast cultivators rushed into the door of life and death. Their bodies were surrounded by the gray brilliance and they fell in mid-air. Seeing Song Yuan rushing out of the door, all the bird and beast cultivators understood that they no longer dared to challenge the door of life and death that even a third-grade illusory sword cultivator could not withstand. They turned around and fled into the distance. Where are you going? Yuan Zhongyu and Liang Mingfu heaved a long sigh of relief. They shouted loudly and waved the banner in their hands with all their might. This time it was different from before. The gray door, which was already 1,000 feet high, chased after more than 10,000 beast cultivators and bird cultivators like a stream of light. All the beast cultivators and bird cultivators who were passed through by the door of life and death did not resist at all. They fell from mid-air, and there was no sign of life. This was really too strange. Even though the soul cultivators and bird cultivators had extremely condensed souls, and even though many of the swordsmen had fought with soul cultivators before, it was indeed the first time they had encountered such a formation that looked similar to soul cultivators on the surface but was actually very different. How could they resist it? Seeing the bird cultivators and beast cultivators falling like dumplings into a pot, all the swordsmen were terrified. One by one, they scattered like birds frightened by the twang of a bow, fleeing in mid-air without any order. They only wanted to avoid the gray brilliance. Chapter 26:41. However, something unexpected happened. A thin and small bird cultivator was flashed by the gray light. His face turned ashen, and he immediately fell from the sky. But it didn't take long for the bird cultivator to open his eyes again. Blinking several times, The bird cultivator steadied himself in the air. Looking left and right, the bird cultivator couldn't believe he was still alive. "Brothers," the bird cultivator cried out. "This array is similar to a soul cultivator's soul array. As long as our soul armaments work, this light won't work on us." The bird cultivator's voice was loud enough for the beast cultivators around him to hear. Many of them were happy to see that they had soul armaments as well. "Roar, hurry!" Song Yuan called out from behind the bird cultivator. "Hurry?" The bird cultivator was stunned again. He didn't understand what Song Yuan meant. At this moment, the gray brilliance had already passed by the bird cultivator and flew forward. The gray brilliance surrounding the bird cultivator became even brighter. There seemed to be a soft, almost inaudible sound. The fluctuation in the bird cultivator's head immediately disappeared, and the bird cultivator fell from the sky without saying another word. This time, although all the bird cultivator's eyes were fixed on him, he did not manage to stabilize himself in midair, nor did he open his eyes again. Everyone understood now that the door of life and death was much more powerful the closer one was to the inside. Even if one could pass through the door of life and death, they wouldn't be able to fly inside. This was the experience the bird cultivator had gained by risking his life. "Let's run." The beast cultivators felt a little more confident in their hearts, but they still couldn't relax. They were chased by the gate of life and death for another few hundred feet, and another few hundred beast cultivators were silently killed. Not a single beast cultivator was able to escape like the bird cultivator from before. It looks like different soul armaments have different uses. The beast cultivator was once again gaining experience. Woo! A sorrowful sound suddenly came from the gate of life and death. The gray light suddenly stopped and didn't move forward an inch. Only the gray light continued to flicker and emit strange fluctuations in an orderly manner. Roar! Song Yuan, who had been trapped by the door of life and death, let out a loud roar. He passed through the door of life and death and came out from the transparent space. A sense of relief washed over Song Yuan's heart. "This array. It's far too powerful." Song Yuan stood in midair, maintaining a certain distance from the door of life and death. The redness in his eyes lessened slightly as his heart was in turmoil. This gray light is not easily destroyed and this door is several hundred feet wide. It seems that the Dao sect intends to push this door forward and force us, the warriors of the Huan Kingdom, into the door so that they can take our lives. But the array has only been pushed by 10%, and thousands of Sword Realm disciples have already died. If things go according to their plan, then wouldn't Sword Realm be meat on the chopping block? We'll be slaughtered by the Dao school? Song Yuan looked at the array and thought to himself anxiously, "But how do we break this door?" "Oh, that's right. Why isn't the door moving?" Song Yuan suddenly realized something. He didn't believe that Yuan Zhongyu from the Kunlun school was trying to persuade him to join the Kunlun school again. Song Yuan looked at Yuan Zhongyu, who was flustered behind the door of life and death, and saw the ripples of mana coming from behind the door of life and death. These Dao school cultivators aren't familiar with this array. Yuan Zhongyu was stalling for time because he wanted to familiarize himself with it. Roar! Song Yuan roared when he thought of that and tried to grab the gray light again. However, just as he reached out his hand, the gray light flashed violently again, and the door moved again. Run! Song Yuan was naturally more experienced than Yuan Zhongyu. Without hesitation, he turned around and fled toward the other side of the array. That was close. In the distance, Yuan Zhongyu and Liang Mingfu broke out in cold sweat on the other side of the door of life and death. The situation just now was truly dangerous. Yuan Zhongyu and Liang Mingfu weren't too familiar with this strange array, and the tens of thousands of disciples from the two sects who were hiding didn't understand the true meaning of this array either. They just blindly activated their mana and thought that it was the same array they usually saw. The faster the door of life and death was pushed, the faster the beast and bird cultivators would die. But they didn't know that this kind of array that was related to the soul was very particular about balance and subtlety. It wasn't something that a brute could operate. Therefore, when the door of life and death was pushed, it produced a trace of obscurity. And in the eyes of Yuan Zhongyu and the others, this obscurity meant that they had to channel in more mana. But when they increased the amount of mana, the door of life and death actually produced a trace of abnormal ripples, and there were even signs of a backlash. Yuan Zhongyu turned pale with fright. Although he didn't understand the method of setting up the door of life and death, those illusory sword realm beast and bird cultivators died the moment they entered the door of life and death. This was beyond his understanding. This door of life and death was definitely a great killing machine. The consequences of the backlash from the door of life and death was definitely not something he could control. It was even possible that tens of thousands of Kunlun's sect disciples would die in the array. Fortunately, when Yuan Zhongyu's soul flew out of his body, the mana he channeled into the flag was interrupted. It was also at this moment that the backlash stopped. The door of life and death naturally stopped there. This kind of unexpected situation was already explained by Xian Tian's sect's Xiong Song in the Jade Slip. Yuan Zhongyu was also familiar with it. But when it came to this, he couldn't help but be flustered. He was really afraid that Song Yuan would turn around. If the door of life and death was destroyed, not only would many Kunlun sect disciples die, but the entire array would also be in danger. Fortunately, as Yuan Zhongyu cast a spell, the door of life and death once again overflowed with a gray brilliance. The door of life and death began to move again. Of course, Song Yuan's decision was also beyond Yuan Zhongyu's expectation. He originally thought that Song Yuan would take advantage of the moment when the door of life and death had just moved, and the mana he channeled into the door of life and death was not stable yet. In this way, Yuan Zhongyu might suffer from the backlash of his mana again. Who knew that when Song Yuan saw the door of life and death moving, he immediately turned around. It seemed that he was not sloppy at all. His huge body was even more agile than a fist-sized mouse. Yuan Zhongyu glanced at Liang Mingfu. Both of their eyes flashed with a trace of luck. At the same time, their hearts were calm. They knew that the door of life and death in the array could only move slowly and not hurriedly. Hence, the two of them activated the flag and directed the mana of tens of thousands of hidden disciples to slowly push the door of life and death towards the fleeing beast cultivators and bird cultivators. Although the movement of the door of life and death was slow, the door was getting bigger and bigger. After pushing for thousands of feet, the door had basically covered the entire array from top to bottom. There was no room for the enemy to move. Yuan Zhongyu and Liang Mingfu's hearts were once again calm. They knew that as long as they pushed the door of life and death in front of the beast cultivators and bird cultivators, they would be forced to have no place to escape. They could only pass through the door of life and death and die. At this moment, Yuan Zhongyu could not help but feel a trace of disdain towards Song Yuan. If Song Yuan had turned around just now, it might have been an opportunity. However, that opportunity was fleeting. Beast cultivators like Song Yuan might not have the guts to do so. However, just as Yuan Zhongyu was secretly sneering, another accident occurred in the array. The giant ape that Song Yuan had transformed into did not return to his original form. Instead, he turned around and dashed towards the other side of the array. He wanted to avoid the unpredictable door of life and death. At this moment, the interior of the array was gray and it was impossible to tell which direction was which. The group of beast cultivators and bird cultivators were simply fleeing in the opposite direction of the door of life and death. However, after running for thousands of feet or even thousands of feet, the gray array suddenly flashed with a black and white brilliance. That brilliance was the brilliance that Song Yuan and the other beast cultivators had seen when they entered the soul-extinguishing array's flag gate. Although the brilliance looked extremely dim, it was extremely clear against the gray background. The giant ape was running with all his might, causing the entire array to tremble. How could Song Yuan not know that the flag gate was located when he suddenly saw such a brilliance in this directionless place? In an instant, the giant ape suddenly changed directions and dashed to the side. At the same time, he even glanced at the door of life and death, which was not too far away from him. That's right. If the door of life and death was pushed to this place and covered the flag gate, how could Song Yuan discover its location? Although the thousands of beast cultivators and bird cultivators who survived saw the giant ape dashing towards the flag gate, Yuan Zhongyu and Liang Mingfu did not care at all. They were golden core cultivators of the Dao sect. How could they not know that the flag gate was an entrance to the array? Once the array was activated, the first step was to cover the entrance. Most of the time, the flag gate was the most heavily guarded place. What was the point of Song Yuan dashing towards the flag gate now? However, when the giant ape reached the flag gate, he extended his huge fist. The fist, which was as big as a hill, hit the black and white brilliance. A loud rumbling sound came from the flag gate. The brilliance on the flag gate suddenly brightened, and the black and white brilliance condensed into a pillar of light. An extremely bad feeling arose in Yuan Zhongyu and Liang Mingfu's hearts. Not good. The barbarians of the Huan country seemed to have found a flaw in the soul-extinguishing array, Liang Mingfu exclaimed in a low voice. Yuan Zhongyu gritted his teeth and said coldly, "It's not that Song Yuan found it. It's that the soul-extinguishing array was originally incomplete. The flag gate's entrance is an obvious flaw. It's not hard to find. It's just that few cultivators who know about arrays would definitely not look for a way out from the flag gate." Sigh. Liang Mingfu shook his head helplessly. This is also because swordsmen are not meant to die. Perhaps. Yuan Zhongyu was a little worried. If my soul-extinguishing array has such a flaw, I'm afraid that the other 9 arrays will also have the same flaw. Then what about the entire array? Although Daoist Xiong's 10-direction annihilation array was passed down from ancient times, I'm afraid that the sword cultivator will escape this time. Sigh, that's right. 9.5 of 10 miles of travel have been wasted. Liang Mingfu sighed. He already understood that there was no way to stop the sword cultivator from escaping. Chapter 2642. Sure enough, when the two of them discovered the flaw in the Great Formation, they sighed in their hearts. They wanted to, but they lacked the strength to, and could only slowly push the gate of life and death. The giant ape's huge fist had already smashed the flag gate, creating a square black and white outline. The brilliant black and white brilliance was like a bright sword that pierced into the gray formation. When the giant ape stretched out its hands, its tree-like fingers grabbed the spot where the black and white brilliance was. Open, the giant ape let out a deafening roar, but the entire formation shook again. With a rumbling sound, like a huge rock rolling down a slope, the flag gate was actually lifted out from the formation by the giant ape. The black and white brilliance trembled at first, then suddenly rushed into the formation, blasting a huge passage out of the gray formation. Whoosh, a clear sound was heard, and a hurricane rushed into the passage. The black and white brilliance in the giant ape's hands disappeared, and the entrance of the flag gate that the sword cultivators had entered from before was revealed in front of the passage. Go! The giant ape raised its arms and pounded its chest a few times. With a roar, all the bird and beast cultivators rushed into the passage like flowing water, quickly disappearing. The giant ape turned around coldly, and its red eyes flashed with mockery. Its gaze was aimed at Yuan Zhongyu. Yuan Zhongyu stared at the giant ape's eyes without flinching, but he said to Liang Mingfu, "Let's rest for a while." "Yes, we'll listen to fellow Yuan's instructions." Liang Mingfu replied and stopped circulating his magic power. Yuan Zhongyu watched as the giant ape turned around and left. He narrowed his eyes and muttered, "What we're thinking." Fellow Daoist Xiong might also be thinking the same thing. How could he not know the flaw in the formation's entrance? This formation is surrounded on all sides. Even we don't know where the entrance is, and sword cultivators may not be able to find it easily. I hope so. Liang Mingfu nodded slightly. Just as he said a few words, the entire soul-extinguishing formation shook violently. This vibration originated from the flag gate that the giant ape had destroyed, and it spread in all directions. Oh no! Yuan Zhongyu suddenly came to a realization and shouted, "Quick! The flaw of this flag gate has already affected the entire array. I'll wait." After that, Yuan Zhongyu didn't know what to say. After all, he only knew how to activate the gate of life and death. He didn't even know how to set up the soul-extinguishing array. How would he know how to withstand the vibrations of this array? Just as Yuan Zhongyu had expected, the earthly annihilation formation was the first to be affected. This was something that Xiong Huasong had personally presided over. At this moment, within the array, the earth was shaking. The cracks were like the mouths of blood beasts, wantonly devouring the swordsman. Even the giant sword that Mu Ting had transformed into was barely holding on. It would not be long before the earth's annihilation array swallowed up all the swordsmen. But at this moment, a bright light suddenly flashed from the top of the dark green earth, and a door appeared in the light. Wasn't it the entrance that Mu Ting and the others had flown in? Oh no! Xiong Huasong was the first cultivator to realize that something was wrong. He glanced around and immediately knew what the problem was. Previously, he had set up a trap in mid-air outside the 10 magic arrays, tricking the swordsmen into attacking. He wanted them to know that the entrance of the magic arrays was the most solid place. He wanted them to enter the 10 major annihilation formations and fear the entrance of the flag gate, so that they wouldn't think of attacking from there. However, no matter how he thought about it, there were still too many flaws in this array. Even though he had taken every conceivable possibility into account, Song Yuan still discovered this flaw that couldn't be concealed. This flaw was fatal. Although Xiong Huasong had discovered it, he was actually in the same situation as Yuan Zhongyu. He couldn't fix it at all. He could only watch as Mu Ting and the other swordsmen discovered that the entrance had appeared. They were wild with joy as they commanded all the surviving swordsmen to rush out of the flag gate. Humph. Xiong Huasong withdrew his transcendence energy and looked coldly at the Earth's annihilation formation, which had returned to normal. The corner of his mouth curled up, and he sneered. So what if you discovered the flaw in the flag gate? Since you've entered my Black Sky Sect's great array, you're dead. I'd like to see how you 100,000 swordsmen will escape from this 10 major annihilation formation. As he spoke, Xiong Huasong waved the flag in his hand. His figure disappeared, and the entire magic array returned to its original state before the swordsmen entered. Even the Earth's annihilation formation, which Xiong Huasong presided over, couldn't stop Mu Ting from escaping. The other magic arrays were also helpless against the swordsmen's escape. One by one, the illusory swordsmen led hundreds of thousands of swordsmen to escape from the magic arrays. Of course, there were still exceptions. Inside the Earth's annihilation formation, the endless yellow sand not only suppressed the swordsmen, but also obliterated all the swordsmen's sword light. Just as the snow-white brilliance pierced into the yellow sand like a sharp sword, revealing a path of survival, thousands of swordsmen were killed by the yellow sand. Not only were their corpses gone, even their flying swords were turned into ordinary iron. Only the illusory swordsmen and the high-level bright swordsmen, led by Jian Li of the Lu Sword sect, were still struggling. Flag Gate. Jian Li found a path of survival and was filled with regret. If he had known that the Flag Gate was a path of survival, even if he risked his life to escape, he wouldn't have ended up like this, which led to nearly half of the Lu Sword sect's disciples being killed. Go! Jian Li didn't hesitate to urge the giant sword. The sword light flashed in the yellow sand. Although it wasn't as smooth and agile as outside the magic array, the yellow sand still couldn't stop the giant sword from flying. The other illusory swords also flew toward the Flag Gate. Jian Li wanted to escape, but how could Qing Ming of the Immortal Ascension sect and Peng Dai of the Su Yen sect allow him to do so? Under the urging of his magic power, the yellow sand became more vigorous and the wind became stronger. All the bright swordsmen found it difficult to move in the yellow sand. At this time, Jian Li had already flown to the Flag Gate. He only needed to urge his sword origin a little, and he would be able to escape. However, in the face of this path of survival, he hesitated. If he escaped, what would happen to the thousands of disciples? Just as he hesitated, several first-grade illusory swordsmen rushed out. Obviously, the path of survival was behind the Flag Gate, and it wasn't a trap set by the Taoist sect's cultivators. Woo! The wind howled like a tornado. The omnipresent yellow sand increased its strength and hit hundreds of second-grade bright swordsmen. Those disciples didn't even have the chance to scream. Their sword light was annihilated and their corpses melted. Forget it! Jian Li's heart sank. Even if I escape, how can I face Lu Ruochang and the others? Immediately after, the sword energy flew back and stopped in midair. The sword light sank into the yellow sand again. Seeing Jian Li's return, Cheng Ming and Peng Dai were slightly stunned. However, at the same time, they saw the huge sword formed by Jian Li's sword emit a brilliance that was several feet long. The overflowing sword energy also rushed in all directions. Not good. This guy is going to self-destruct. Peng Dai suddenly realized and was about to warn Jian Li. She saw the array tremble and a powerful suction force was born from the huge sword. The spiritual energy of heaven and earth within a few hundred feet of the huge sword swarmed toward it. The hurricane immediately tangled with the Yin wind within the array. The yellow sand that filled the sky lost its momentum and slowly fell to the ground. Woo! The huge sword emitted a strong sword hum. That hum was filled with sorrow. Woo! The flying swords of the remaining thousands of bright swordsmen that were suppressed under the yellow sand were also attracted by the huge sword. They all emitted a sonorous sword hum. At the same time, following this loud sword hum, these flying swords were slowly sucked out of the yellow sand. We can't let these swordsmen escape. Cheng Ming was also anxious. Although they had killed many swordsmen just now, those swordsmen were only at the nurturing sword and bright sword stage. There weren't many who were at the bright sword stage who had fallen. This was the key to killing the swordsmen who had real combat power. However, before Cheng Ming and Peng Dai could activate the flag again. Boom! With a loud bang, the giant sword emitted an extremely dazzling brilliance. Then, this brilliance cracked inch by inch, turning into thousands of crystal fragments. These crystal fragments charged into the yellow sand and emitted thousands of sword chi. Moreover, these crystal fragments did not scatter in all directions as the sword force's origin spirit disappeared. Instead, they enveloped the space within a radius of several hundred feet. It seemed to be a secret technique, but it also seemed to be a sword formation. The sword chi on each crystal fragment circled around each other, controlling the yellow sand that was wreaking havoc in this space. For a moment, it felt as if the wind had calmed down. Rise, rise, rise. Qingming and Pang Dai tried their best to activate the flag, but all the yellow sand and hurricanes couldn't be controlled as they wished. Run. How could the thousands of Lu Jian sect swordsmen not know the reason behind this? This Jian Li had used his own life to give them a chance to live. They all had tears in their eyes as they urged their flying swords to fly out of the still yellow sand and towards the path of life. If Jian Li of the Lu Jian sect, who was at the second grade of the illusory sword stage, sacrificed himself in exchange for the survival of thousands of his disciples in the Earth Destruction Formation, then the situation in the Wind Destruction Formation was even more tragic. Moreover, this Wind Destruction Formation was jointly managed by Chongbai sect's Li Jijia, Chen Fan Valley Xueqi, and Tongyi sect's Ko Xiangling, the three golden core cultivators. There were more disciples of the three sects hidden than the two sects in the Earth Destruction Formation. The hurricanes were each stronger than the last. The sharp wind blades were like sharp swords that cut the throat. They were even more deadly than the piercing yellow sand. Not to mention the time it took to drink a cup of tea, there were already dozens of hurricanes blowing out from the whirlpool, killing thousands of Lu Jian sect swordsmen. Even the huge sword formed by Xueqi's illusory swordsman was blown away by the wind like thin paper. It was tightly attached to the huge sword, as if it would be blown apart with the slightest movement. As for the area protected by the dozens of illusory swords, it was getting smaller and smaller. It couldn't protect the other swordsmen at all. In fact, the light was gradually fading and was about to disappear. Chapter 2643. Xueqi didn't expect the Taoist sect cultivators to have such a powerful formation. He had never seen such a formation in the 10 years he had been participating in the Great War of Tao cultivators. This formation had long since destroyed his impression of the weak Tao sect cultivators in his heart. Just as he was pondering whether or not he should use other secret techniques other than the sword transformation technique, he heard a real rumbling sound in the air. The same snow-white brilliance shone in and pierced deeply into the hurricane. Flag Gate. Xueqi was overjoyed when he saw the brilliance. He wanted to use his secret technique, but he didn't have a place to escape. Wasn't the sudden appearance of the Flag Gate giving him a chance of survival? Wasn't this a gift from the heavens? Almost without hesitation, the sword light around Xueqi flashed violently. The thin sword light suddenly became thicker like a sticky milk. This sticky milk started to sway slightly, and an indescribable sword chi rushed out from the huge sword. It forced away the chilling wind that was like a saw blade, forming a space of 1 foot wide. Buzz! Another strong sword sound came from the giant sword. The brilliance of the giant sword became brighter and brighter with the sword sound. It was almost blinding. Boom! The brilliance of the giant sword scattered in all directions. Oh no, why did this guy suddenly want to self-destruct? Xueqi of the Chen Fan Valley raised his eyebrows and was puzzled. After all, the hurricane of the wind extinguishing formation was stronger than the previous one. It wasn't strong enough to threaten a second-grade illusory sword. No. Li Jijia of the Chongbai sect had seen the Flag Gate open. He sneered. This guy is trying to escape. Humph. Do you think you can survive after falling into my hands? Li Jijia then snorted coldly. He formed a strange seal in his hand and pointed at a spot on the flag. An earthy yellow light appeared on the flag and disappeared in an instant. Li Jijia's face suddenly turned pale, as if he had consumed a lot of spiritual power just now. Whoosh, with a very soft sound, a flying sword the size of a person rushed out of the huge sword that had exploded. Just as Li Jijia said, the flying sword's brilliance was extremely restrained, and the sword energy was extremely sharp. Following the momentum generated by the explosion of the huge sword, it rushed like a meteor towards the reopened Flag Gate. Senior Brother Xue. Several illusory swordsmen around Xueqi shouted. Their protective sword radiance had already been destroyed by Xueqi's secret technique. Even if there were a few swordsmen who used secret techniques to transform into swords, they couldn't withstand the huge force of the explosion. In the flashes of the sword radiance, they could no longer maintain their swords' forms and return to their physical bodies. Woo! A gust of wind that sounded like the wailing of ghosts and howling of wolves blew in mercilessly. It passed through their sword light and rushed into their bodies. Their flesh was torn open, and their lives were blown away by the wind. If the illusory swordsmen were like this, then the bright swordsmen were even worse. They struggled bitterly in the wind, but unexpectedly, their sword radiance was scattered by Xueqi's explosion. In an instant, hundreds of swordsmen died. The swordsmen of the bright young sword sect had ended up like this, but the culprit had passed through the irresistible wind in an instant and rushed to the front of the flag gate. However, Xueqi was only a second-grade illusory swordsman after all. Although he used the secret technique to increase his flying speed, he couldn't maintain his sword's form. When he was about to reach the flag gate overflowing with snow-white brilliance, his physical body gradually appeared. Woo! Just when Xueqi was a little anxious and wanted to take advantage of the fact that the secret technique was still effective and his physical body had not been completely revealed to enter the flag gate, a reddish-yellow chilly wind blew out from a whirlwind the size of a human head above the flag gate. That chilly wind was like a sword. It rotated slightly in mid-air and swooped down toward Xueqi. The spiral-shaped wind blade seemed to be able to cut the air. Seeing this, Xueqi's expression didn't change much. He already knew that the person in charge of the wind-extinguishing array must have some secret technique that he didn't know, which could prevent him from escaping. Therefore, from the tip of his sword that had yet to reveal his head, a reddish-red sword radiance rushed out. Then, a powerful sword aura was born from the sword radiance, and a reddish-red sword essence, like the rising sun, rapidly rotated to meet the wind blade that was coming at him. Unexpectedly, when the sword essence that Xueqi had been brewing came into contact with the wind blade, it immediately froze, as though it was frozen. In the blink of an eye, there was a crisp "kachub" sound. This sound was nothing in the whistling chilly wind, but when it stopped in Xueqi's ears, it was as though the entire array was about to be split apart. The sword essence that was like the rising sun actually turned into fragments of light, and the shimmering sword radiance was still swaying from the fragments. Seeing that the wind blade didn't slow down even after the sword essence was broken, Xueqi was finally shocked. However, the wind blade was still faster than his flying speed. At this moment, although Xueqi's head was close to the edge of the flag gate, the wind blade had already rushed to Xueqi's waist. Go! Xueqi opened his mouth slightly, and a small reddish-red sword flew out from his exposed head. If it were not for the flaw in the flag gate, not to mention Xueqi, a second-grade illusory swordsman, who could not escape from the wind-extinguishing formation, even she, a third-grade illusory swordsman, would not be able to escape from the earth-extinguishing formation. Of course, she was extremely embarrassed when she escaped, but she escaped after all. Yes, LV Genyu, after all, Xueqi is a second-grade illusory swordsman. The sword force of the Lu Jian sect is also a second-grade illusory swordsman. In order to protect the disciples of his sect and escape from the earth-extinguishing formation, he self-destructed and died. Xueqi and the disciples of the Bright Yang Sword sect should not have a chance to escape. At this time, Song Yuan had already returned to his human form. He still had a tall figure, but his hoarse voice was full of exhaustion. Obviously, he had consumed a lot of energy in the earth-extinguishing formation. Wait for another 30 minutes. LV Ruocheng said in a low voice. Maybe they still have a chance to survive. Hearing this, the group of swordsmen did not say anything more. Although they were very afraid of the 10 great formations and did not dare to lead their disciples to the flag gate to find the whereabouts of Xueqi and the disciples of the Bright Young Sword sect, it was not a big deal to wait a little longer. Taking advantage of this time, we should also think more. LV Ruocheng glanced around and said in a low voice, think about what happened in the formation just now, and think about how to break this formation. Song Yuan shook his head slightly and said in a low voice, I'm afraid that the previous strategy of dividing and attacking will not work. We can only try to attack one place. But, Ruling continued, what LV Genyu said earlier was right. This kind of formation that is spread all over the place must be broken at the same time. If we attack for a while, it will definitely attract the combined forces of all the Dao sect cultivators. At that time, hundreds of thousands of cultivators will be able to withstand the attack formed by this formation. It is far from what hundreds of thousands of sword cultivators can withstand. They had never heard of the so-called sky extinguishing array, earth extinguishing array, fire extinguishing array, soul extinguishing array, blood extinguishing array, ice extinguishing array, and metal extinguishing array. What made them even more frightened was that the attacking methods of these arrays were far beyond their expectations, and the means were far beyond their knowledge. Especially the soul extinguishing array, which was said to be the gate of life and death. As long as one crossed it, one's soul would be scattered. Even Song Yuan, who was a third-grade illusory sword expert, could not go deep into it with the help of the giant ape celestial body. Even LV Ruochang and other third-grade illusory swordsmen could not go very far, even if they transformed into swords. This was really terrible, and it really made the swordsmen shudder. Of course, this only made them tremble in fear. What made them even more disheartened was that the attacking methods of each array were different, and each method was so strange and so powerful. Even if they listened to each other's words, it was impossible to find a weaker array to attack. LV Ruochang's heart turned cold. She really did not expect this 10-direction annihilation array to be so arrogant. She originally thought that the metal extinguishing array that she had entered was the most powerful array among the 10 great arrays. But now, after listening to it, it seemed that her metal extinguishing array was nothing. Not to mention the soul extinguishing array, even the earth extinguishing array, which was used by the Lu Jian sect's sword force, might not be able to bring thousands of disciples out safely. Then, LV Ruochang looked at the flag gate of the array that Xueqi was trapped in. Now that the flag gate had been opened for a long time, she did not see any swordsmen coming out after such a long time. Xueqi. There were still tens of thousands of disciples of the Mingyang sword sect that had not been seen. Junior sister LV Ruoling was beside her, and her expression was not pleasant. She wanted to comfort LV Ruochang, but when the words came to her mouth, she did not know how to say them. She knew in her heart that before the Battle of the Sword Catacomb, the swordsmen did indeed have the advantage. If LV Ruochang did not have the intention to wipe out all the Dao sect cultivators, the swordsmen would definitely have won if they fought steadily. At least, they would not have been in such a hopeless situation now. The root cause of all this was LV Ruochang. Ruoling did not know what the other swordsmen were thinking, but in her heart, there was no way she did not blame LV Ruochang. Senior sister Ruoling. LV Ruochang smiled bitterly and raised her head to look at Ruoling. Seeing LV Ruochang's bitter smile, Ruoling's heart ached slightly, as if she was lamenting the heavy responsibility on the shoulders of this cold female swordsman. She said casually, "We do not know the name of the array that Xueqi is trapped in, and we do not know the dangers inside. However, according to this sword's thoughts, we must not enter this formation again. If junior sister wants to find an array to attack, I'm afraid you can only choose the last array that no one has entered yet." LV Ruochang pondered for a moment, then raised her head and said, "My fellow swordsmen, do you all have the same plan?" Song Yuan immediately added, "Apart from the soul extinguishing array that I have broken through, all other arrays are fine. This soul extinguishing array, I still have lingering fears. It's better not to try it." Ruoling also said, "The fire extinguishing array is filled with true samadhi fire, which is the bane of swordsmen like us. From what I see, this array is not suitable for attacking. Apart from this array, all other arrays are fine." That's right. The rest of the swordsmen agreed. It seemed that apart from the array that they had broken through, they could try any other array. LV Ruochang also sighed in her heart and said, "The metal extinguishing array that I have broken through was formed by absorbing the gold elemental heaven and earth spiritual chi of the sword catacomb, as well as the remnant sword will and sword chi. Although it is not as strange as the soul extinguishing array that swordsman Song Yuan has broken through, it is still the most powerful array out of all these arrays. I do not recommend breaking through again. From the looks of it, it can only be the last array." Mu Ting and the rest turned to look at the water extinguishing array that no one had entered yet. But what is inside that array? What is the name of the array? We don't even know it. Zhu Chengye bit his lip, his white hair fluttering in the wind, and the frost on his face becoming more apparent. Dao sect cultivators use the 5 elements as their foundation, so most of the arrays are also based on them. LV Ruochang thought for a moment and said, "This array has already shown earth, fire, and metal. This last array should be either wood or water, right?" LV Ruochang's tone was full of uncertainty. After all, the arrays that everyone had mentioned earlier included heaven, earth, soul, wind, and so on. This last array could not possibly exclude thunder, light, and so on, right? She even had a vague feeling that the possibility of using wood or water as the array's base was the smallest. If only swordsman Xueqi could break through. Chu Jianchong sighed softly. If the array that he has broken through is either wood or water, then it will be easy to judge the last array. It was as if 10 intelligent worms were randomly crawling within the canopy. The other swordsmen were somewhat worried about the future and didn't pay attention to the changes in the canopy. Now that they saw it, their expressions changed slightly. Needless to say, this 10-direction annihilation array was in the final stage of its preparation. No matter which formation they charged into, they would be faced with an unprecedented baptism of wind and rain. That's right, fellow Taoist Lu, Ruoling suddenly asked. If we charge into a formation, then can the Tao sect's cultivators gather the magical powers of hundreds of thousands of cultivators together? Of course they can. LV Ruochang smiled bitterly. If not, how can it be called a formation? In an instant, everyone's expressions changed again. Hundreds of thousands of swordsmen against hundreds of thousands of cultivators, not to mention a formation, even if they directly started a fight, it would be disastrous. What could these dozens of illusory swordsmen do? Hee, we're already here. Fellow Taoist Lu, hurry up and tell us, should we charge into the last formation or not? Let's have a good time. Song Yuan grinned and said. However, LV Ruochang's tightly knitted brows didn't seem to loosen. She shook her head slightly and said, Fellow Taoist Song Yuan, please wait a moment. I seem to have thought of something, but I can't seem to grasp it. Moreover, the disciples who went to investigate haven't returned yet. Let's wait a little longer? Although LV Ruochang's words were somewhat tactful, her tone was unquestionable. She did have a hint of understanding in her heart, but she didn't know what the key was. It's all right, junior sister LV. Think about it more. Ruling smiled and said, we'll also meditate for a while. But Zhu Qingye was a little anxious. Although we have a lot of time, this formation is obviously brewing. If we charge into the formation one step earlier, we'll definitely be able to kill them all by surprise. Zhu Qingye's words obviously represented the thoughts of some swordsmen. Chu Jianchong, Tian Simu, and the others turned to look at LV Ruochang. However, LV Ruochang didn't pay attention to them at all. Instead, she raised her head and looked at the flowing colors in the sky. She was so focused that she looked like a girl in love who was looking at the sunset. The brilliance of the 10 colors was like the sunset glow. It illuminated LV Ruochang's eyes, but it could not ignite the spark in her heart. Similarly, the flowing colors illuminated the faces of many swordsmen, but it could not drive away the increasing anxiety in their eyes. After 2 hours, the flowing colors became even more oppressive, and the brilliance became even more dazzling. 10 red lights like the eyes of hungry wolves revealed a ferocious look in the thick fog, and were getting closer and closer. Just as the crowd was getting impatient, the thousands of disciples who had gone out returned. The array was not big to begin with, but they were really very careful. Other than the moving flag gate and the rolling fog, they had checked every inch of the array. However, looking at their dejected appearances, it was needless to say that they didn't find anything. What did you find? Ruling asked with a smile when she saw that LV Ruochang ignored the disciples and only looked up. Senior sister Ruling, please no. A disciple from Failing Sword Manor hurriedly replied, we didn't find anything. There were no flaws. Then, he hesitated for a moment before saying, there's also an extremely powerful restriction under the ground of this formation. A disciple who can burrow into the ground controlled a flying sword to enter, but after a rumbling sound came from the ground, he never came out. In addition, we also tried to fly higher, but after reaching a certain height, we found it difficult to fly any further. It seems to be a restriction of the Tao sect. Also, the disciple licked his somewhat dry lips, as if he had many things to say, but did not know how to say them. Sigh, in short. We used many methods, but this formation is like a large jar airtight. Yes, you can go back and wait. The smile on Ruling's face did not change. This result could be summed up in one sentence, and this disciple was right. After the disciples returned to their groups, Ruling looked at LV Ruochang and said in a warm voice, Junior sister LV, if we can find any clues, I'm afraid that it will be in an instant. However, if we can't find any clues, we probably won't be able to do it in the remaining 2 hours. Zhu Jianyou's words are reasonable. At this moment, the Dao sect cultivators are also familiarizing themselves with the formation. If we seize the opportunity to attack, we will be able to catch them off guard. Even if there's a mistake in the last formation, we can still charge out. However, if we wait for them to fully understand the formation and the entire formation closes, we won't even have a way out. Yes, LV Jianyu. Mu Ting was also somewhat impatient and reminded her in a low voice. All right. At this moment, LV Ruochang reluctantly shifted her gaze away from the sky curtain. Her face was as calm as water. Looking at the red lanterns of the water destruction formation and the already opened flag gate, she waved her hand and said, "Swordsman, listen to my command." Yes. The swordsmen were in high spirits and shouted, "We will listen to LV Jianyou's command." Black Phoenix Sword Sect in front, Failing Sword Village behind. LV Ruochang casually ordered, as natural as moving clouds and flowing water. In a moment, all the disciples of the sword sect were properly arranged. Finally, she took another look at the colorful sky curtain and took a deep breath. Raising her hand, she took the lead and rode on her sword, shouting, "Victory or defeat will be decided in this battle. Warriors of the sword domain, follow me into the formation and kill the Dao sect's god cultivators." After saying that, a resounding sword cry was emitted from the flying sword under her feet, like the cry of a phoenix. Ga. The flying swords of dozens of swordsmen also cried out, and there was no lack of desperation in them. Then the flying swords of hundreds of thousands of swordsmen also cried out, and a feeling of wind blowing and cold water spread throughout the entire formation. Hundreds of thousands of flying swords cried out, causing the spiritual chi of heaven and earth to flow within the great battle, rolling up a hurricane. The hurricane blew up the sword formation of tens of thousands of swordsmen, making a whistling sound. At this time, LV Ruochang had already flown to the front of the flag gate of the water destruction array. Looking at the snow-white brilliance of the flag gate, she took a deep breath. Her messy hair blocked her vision. Although it did not affect anything, she still elegantly stretched out her hand like all women who loved beauty. But just as she did so, her heart suddenly skipped a beat. Gold attributes spiritual chi of heaven and earth. Gold attributes spiritual chi of heaven and earth. LV Ruochang's heart suddenly became clear. The gold attribute spiritual chi of heaven and earth in this great formation is more abundant than the other 5 elements spiritual chi of heaven and earth. The gold attribute spiritual chi of heaven and earth in this sword tomb is even more abundant. Among the formations set up by the Dao sect's cultivators, the gold attribute formation is certainly more powerful than the ordinary ones. But the spirit chi backlash of the formation itself is also stronger than the other formations. GMO and the others who are in charge of the gold destruction formation also have to use double the amount of magic power to control the formation. Furthermore, the cultivators who set up this formation only consider the abundance of gold attribute spiritual chi of heaven and earth, and did not need to have a high cultivation level. Even the cultivators who are in charge of the gold destruction formation are ordinary gold core cultivators. There is not even a cultivator on duty in the conference hall. Chapter 2646. Looking at the sky, the golden brilliance seems to be stronger than the other brilliances. The other brilliances are all blocked by this golden brilliance. There are obviously traces of deliberate movement in the flow. I'm afraid it's trying to maintain the balance between them. If that's the case, then there should be a balance between the 10 formations. If we attack the formation of golden destruction at the same time and draw in a large amount of heaven and earth spiritual chi, wouldn't it be able to strengthen our attacks and disrupt the balance of the formation? If it's done well, wouldn't the backlash from the metal attribute spiritual energy of heaven and earth be able to destroy the golden destruction formation? LV Ruochang thought for a moment, but the more she thought about it, the more she felt that it made sense. Looking at the flag gate of the water destruction array that was almost within reach, LV Ruochang made up her mind. If she didn't fight now, when would she? Thus, a burst of sword brilliance radiated from her body, and a cheerful sword cry suddenly sounded. Her figure rose up in front of the flag gate and rushed straight into the air. An extremely confident voice sounded in the air. "Disciples, listen to my command. Kill your way into the golden destruction array." Seeing that LV Ruochang was about to rush into the water destruction array, there was a sudden change. The dazzling sword radiance emitted 5 colors, like a beautiful peacock spreading its proud tail, causing all the swordsmen to be stunned. Fortunately, behind LV Ruochang were the disciples of the Black Phoenix Sword Sect. These disciples worshipped LV Ruochang to the extreme. Whether it was the first or second grade illusory swordsmen, or the disciples who had drawn their swords or nurtured their swords, they hurriedly changed direction with LV Ruochang. Although it looked a little chaotic at first, in a moment, it was orderly. The other sword sect disciples naturally had room to maneuver after following the Black Phoenix Sword Sect. However, Xueqi and the others were really puzzled. Dozens of illusory swordsmen ordered their disciples to lead the other swordsmen to follow the Black Phoenix Sword Sect to the water destruction array. At the same time, they all gathered in the direction where LV Ruochang was flying. LV Ruochang also flew to the front of the water destruction array with a smile and stood in the air. Obviously, she was also waiting for the arrival of everyone. Junior sister LV, what's going on? Could it be that you suddenly have a way to break the array? Ruoling saw LV Ruochang's smiling face, which was far from the frown just now, and asked with a smile. All right, senior sister Ruoling knows. Lu Ruochang said proudly. Although I'm not 100% sure, but I'm still somewhat confident. LV Jianyu, quickly tell me. Zhu Qingye hurriedly asked. LV Ruochang didn't hide anything and spoke of his thoughts. He then said, this sword stopped to discuss with you sword friends because I want to advance and retreat with you. Once we enter the Golden Destruction Formation, we won't need to say a word. The disciples of the 10 sword sects will form their own sword formations. We will also turn into swords and attack the Golden Destruction Formation. There can't be any delay and we can't give the Dao sect cultivators any time to catch their breath. He even asked them to gather all the cultivators into the Golden Destruction Formation. Otherwise, even without the Golden Destruction Formation, they would still be able to kill us. Humph, kill him. Song Yuan coldly snorted. I'd like to see which cultivator doesn't want to live anymore and dares to block my path. LV Ruochang's lips curled into a smile. She was in an extremely good mood. Although she knew that Song Yuan's words had many flaws, she didn't refute. Sword friends, is there anything else you want to explain? LV Ruochang shouted. Otherwise, we'll have to summon all our sword energy and give the cultivators a surprise. LV Jianyu. Chu Zhenchong hesitated. Everything you say is reasonable, but since the strongest part of the formation is also the weakest part of the formation, then what we'll face will definitely be the strongest attack of the 10 formations. Do you think we can withstand the strongest attack of this formation? Chu Zhenchong obviously didn't believe in the idea of breaking through the Golden Destruction Formation. No matter how strong the Golden Destruction Formation is, can it be more unpredictable than the Soul Destruction Formation? Song Yuan sneered. I'm not even afraid of the Soul Destruction Formation, so why should I be afraid of this Golden Destruction Formation? Although Song Yuan's words didn't convey his meaning and didn't answer Chu Zhenchong's question, his support for LV Ruochang was obvious. LV Ruochang nodded slightly and looked straight at Chu Zhenchong. She said word by word, even if you can't withstand it, you have to. Even if you can't withstand it, you have to. If we can't break the Golden Destruction Formation, we'll all die. I believe that I can die in the end. If sword friend Chu doesn't fight, I'm afraid you'll be the first to die among the 10 illusory swordsmen. Chu Zhenchong's expression changed. LV Ruochang had really spoken his mind. He was only at the 2nd grade of the illusory sword realm, which was similar to the cultivation of LV Ruochang's disciples. He was really worried that he couldn't withstand the attack of the Golden Destruction Formation. Forget it. We'll die either way. Chu Zhenchong raised his head and said, there are no cowards among the warriors of the sword realm. Although Chu doesn't think that the Golden Destruction Formation is the best place to break through, Chu still believes in LV Jianyu. Good. LV Ruochang clapped her hands and said, with sword friend Chu's determination, it won't be difficult for us to break the Golden Destruction Formation. However, after saying that, LV Ruochang's expression became serious again. She said, sword friend Chu's words reminded me again. Every sect in the sword realm should have a secret technique to absorb sword intent. In my opinion, we should find an opportunity in the Golden Destruction Formation to absorb the sword intent absorbed by the Golden Destruction Formation from the sword tomb. This will be able to crush the Golden Destruction Formation. However, in this way among us, there may be people who will die because of this. Ha ha ha, there's no need to be afraid. Why should we be afraid? Ruoling clapped her hands and said, If sword friend Chu can have such ambition, how can we not have such a magnificent feat? We'll listen to LV Genyo's instructions. Good. LV Ruocheng looked at the Black Phoenix Sword sect disciples who had already rushed into the Golden Destruction formation and said, "We'll be the last to enter." We'll listen to LV Genyo's instructions. The hearts of the illusory swordsmen trembled, and the sword energy in their bodies began to flow slowly. They knew that once they entered the formation, they had to go all out. If they couldn't break the Golden Destruction formation in a short time, the consequences would be unimaginable. It was unknown whether it was on purpose or because of the formation, but after the Golden Destruction formation's flag gate opened, it actually shrank a little. It took a lot of time for hundreds of thousands of swordsmen to fly into the formation. During this time, the entire 10-direction annihilation formation's closing speed increased. Obviously, the Golden Core Realm cultivators in charge of the formation had also seen the final struggle of the swordsmen and had begun the final encirclement. Go! Life or death depends on this strike, victory or defeat depends on this battle. Seeing that there were still a few swordsmen who had not flown into the Golden Destruction formation, LV Ruocheng waved his hand and said, "Go! Life or death depends on this strike." Rua Ling and the others roared and rushed into the Golden Destruction formation on their flying swords. When the dozens of illusory swordsmen flew into the Golden Destruction formation, hundreds of thousands of swordsmen had already gathered in dozens of places according to the sword formation secret method of their respective sword sections. Apart from the Black Phoenix Sword sect disciples who had already seen the momentum of the Sword Mountain and Sword Water in the Golden Destruction formation, the other swordsmen had not seen it before. Although they had already gathered into a sword formation, when they glanced around the formation, their faces were filled with astonishment. Obviously, they were also stunned by the atmosphere in the formation. Opposite the hundreds of thousands of swordsmen were GMO from Sky Patrol City, Ji Hong from Clear Leaf Sect, Zhou Qingping from Thousand Leaf Ridge, and Zhu Junwei from Cool Breeze Valley. Just like before, the four of them each held a small banner in their hands that shone with golden light. However, their faces were filled with confusion and surprise. When LV Ruocheng was trapped in the Golden Destruction formation, the boner-eroding golden light had killed many Black Phoenix Sword sect disciples. Even LV Ruocheng's body was injured. If Zhang Yuan had not torn open the banner gate of the Soul Destruction formation and exposed the flaw of the formation, and if LV Ruocheng had not taken the opportunity to lead the Black Phoenix Sword sect disciples to escape in a panic, LV Ruocheng might have already died in the golden light. Who would have thought that just over 2 hours later, the hundreds of thousands of swordsmen would actually turn around and charge into the Golden Destruction formation, which really caught GMO and the others off guard. While they were reporting to Xiong Song and the others, they hurriedly arranged the formation so that the disciples who had already relaxed could regain their spirit and face the final counterattack of all the swordsmen. This was all the swordsmen, far more than the tens of thousands of Black Phoenix Sword sect disciples. At the same time, GMO and the others were somewhat confused. They didn't know how LV Ruocheng, who had suffered greatly in this formation, could return to the Golden Annihilation formation again. Was she not afraid of dying under the bone-corroding golden light? When GMO of Sky Patrol City saw LV Ruocheng and the others fly to the front of the swordsman, he sneered as usual. He waved the small banner in his hand slightly, and golden light overflowed from it. He asked, "LV Ruocheng, you still haven't given up. Why? Do you really want to choose this Golden Destruction formation as your burial place?" Then, he looked at the dozens of illusory swordsmen and said, "It's fine that you came here alone, but you actually gave us such a great battle merit. This great gift. We really have to thank you. Don't you think so, fellow cultivators?" GMO even turned to Ji Hong and the others and asked them in a very confident manner. "That's right, LV Ruocheng really knows our intentions." Ha ha ha. Ji Hong and the others laughed. At this moment Wang. Countless sword cries resounded in front of Ji Hong and the others. The dozens of illusory swordsmen did not say anything. Various colored sword lights appeared around them, and their sword energy soared into the sky. All the swordsmen who could use secret techniques to transform into swords did so. Even Zhang Yuan of the Quilted Mountain sect roared, and his body rapidly expanded. The dozens of huge swords seemed to have taken off their huge scabbards, and they revealed a ferocious appearance in the Golden Destruction formation. Chapter 26:47. What was different from before was that as the four small banners waved, A strange wave of energy was produced and spread rapidly in all directions. Wherever the ripples passed, the images formed by the broken swords would collapse. Swords that seemed like broken swords and sword intents would break down from the images, and they would be swept up into the sky like sand dunes by the wind. A feeling of annihilation rose in the hearts of all the sword cultivators. A feeling of disbelief rose in their hearts at the same time. They had never imagined that the Dao Sex array would be so mysterious. Buzz, the moment the sword world broke down, LV Ruochang and the other huge swords did not give GMO and the others any chance to wave the small banners again. At the same time, dozens of terrifying auras, mixed with absolute sword chi, attacked GMO and the others. Under the impact of the sword chi, the waves of energy from the four small banners showed signs of stagnation. In fact, the broken swords within a few hundred feet of the waves were showing signs of reforming again. The sword mountain and sword water were gradually returning to their original state. Kill! The swordsmen were overjoyed when they saw this. Hundreds of thousands of swordsmen roared in unison and summoned their flying swords. The flying swords danced and formed dozens of huge flying swords, flashing brilliantly as they slashed down at the sword mountain in the distance that was beginning to return to its original state. The flying swords were about to hit the swordsmen. If the sword mountain was hit, it would only collapse. Once the sword mountain collapsed, the entire golden destruction array would naturally have a flaw. However, at this critical moment, a cold voice came from the distant horizon. So, you've been waiting for the golden destruction array. You want to break my golden destruction array with just 100,000 flying swords? What wishful thinking. At the place where the voice came from, the entire sword mountain collapsed like quicksand. The quicksand flowed rapidly from that place, and all the illusions in the golden destruction array instantly turned into nothingness. Xiong Huasong, Hang Li, and several other mid-golden core cultivators appeared at the origin of the collapse of the illusions. As they waved their banners, raindrops, waves, and mountain-like broken swords rushed toward the flying swords of the swordsmen. Rumble, rumble, endless sounds rang out, and earth-shattering explosions rang out. The entire golden destruction formation was in a state of chaos, and it was like a scene from purgatory. In the entire world, there were only swords, sword light, and sword chi. Fellow Taoist Ji! Xiong Huasong yelled in exasperation. Hurry up and activate the golden destruction formation. It turned out that even though Xiong Huasong and the others were able to control the broken swords of the golden destruction formation, they were still unable to activate the bone-corroding golden light of the golden destruction formation. Even though the thousands of broken swords could withstand the attacks of the 100,000 sword cultivators for a short period of time, they were absolutely unable to withstand the attacks of the sword cultivators for a long period of time, let alone kill the sword cultivators. Wang! Several loud and clear sounds of swords rang out amidst the violent explosion. Although it was not as powerful as before, it was just as resounding. Boom! An extremely loud sound rang out at the end of the first wave of attacks. The attacks of LV Ruochang and the others had collided with the attacks of GMO and the others. The sound this time was not as loud as before, but the entire formation shook violently. All the cultivators and swordsmen were unable to stand firm in mid-air, and they all staggered as they tried their best to maintain their balance. The expressions of the bystanders were of course shocked by the power of the formation, but Xiong Huasong's face was pale, and he was extremely anxious. This was because he knew that GMO and the others were at the base of the golden destruction formation. This base was not fixed within the formation, but GMO and the others had not completely activated the golden destruction formation. The base of the formation was beneath their feet. If LV Ruochang and the others' giant swords killed GMO and the others, the base of the formation would also be destroyed, and all the Dao Sect's previous efforts would be for naught. How could Xiong Huasong dare to be negligent? He waved the banner in his hand, and another part of the sword will of heaven and earth seeped in. Seemingly endless flying swords rushed into the formation and flew in the direction of the giant swords. Hung Zhao and the others naturally came to their senses, and all their attacks were temporarily directed towards the giant swords. Rumble! Another series of explosions rang out, and sword splendor filled the entire formation. Not only did everyone feel dizzy, but they also did not dare to release their divine senses. The power of the golden destruction formation and the countless remnant sword wills had caused great damage to their divine senses. LV Ruochang and the others were in a dilemma. Wherever the giant swords were, the sword chi had already blocked the sword rain that GMO and the others had summoned. Even Ruoling's sword light had pierced towards Ji Hong's eyes. Under the sword light, the small banner's golden light only flashed slightly before being annihilated. As long as LV Ruochang and the others put in more effort, this golden destruction formation would be destroyed. It was a pity that Xiong Huasong and the others' assistance was timely. The monstrous sword rain hit the dozens of giant swords, and the sword splendor of the third-grade illusory swordsmen were disrupted. Facing the fierce sword rain and the sword will that seemed to be driven by tens of thousands of cultivators, these swordsmen were helpless. They could only retreat slightly. Of course, it was during this slight retreat that 4 sword-like golden lights appeared in the air amidst the splashes of sword radiance. These 4 sword lights suddenly exploded and turned into tens of thousands of crystal fragments that shot out in all directions of the sword formation. What a pity! When LV Ruochang saw the golden lights appear, she knew that the bone-corroding golden light was not stopped. She felt that it was a pity. At the same time, she hurriedly activated the sword origin, and the entire giant sword flashed with the sword will of the phoenix. This sword will slowly converged, and a faint fluctuation was slowly emitted. This fluctuation swayed along with the sword light as if it was breathing. It was emitted by LV Ruochang, who had yet to merge the sword spirit and sword will into the sword heart. Swoosh, the golden light shot out in all directions, like the rising sun, and plated the entire golden destruction array with a layer of golden light. This golden light had already touched the broken sword will and thousands of broken swords, and immediately bloomed with a strong brilliance. Oh no! All the disciples of the Black Phoenix Sword sect shouted in their hearts. The other disciples of the Sword Gate had only heard about it, but they had personally experienced it. What kind of golden light was that? What kind of bone-corroding golden light was that? The pain was definitely not something that could be described with words. The golden light flashed without much noise. In this array where the swords clashed and the sounds of the swords clashing were incessant, it was nothing at all. However, wherever the golden light passed, the sword light of the swordsmen melted and their sword chi was corroded. Hundreds and thousands of screams were heard. Among the screams, hundreds and thousands of disciples who were pregnant with swords fell from the sky in batches, their bodies covered in blood. In the midst of the blood, eerie white bones could be seen. Chapter 26:48. In an instant, all the swordsmen panicked. It was not that the disciples of the Black Phoenix Sword sect had not mentioned such a situation before, but to them, it was something new. Everyone felt that they could resist this strange golden light. Only now did they truly believe that there was something they could not resist within the Dao sect's array. As soon as the golden light flashed, the figures of GMO and the others disappeared. The base of the array was also hidden within the array. Xiong Huasong and the others also revealed a trace of a smile on their faces. As the flagpoles swayed, their figures also disappeared into the air. At this moment, the golden light once again landed on the huge sword that LV Ruochang had transformed into. The fluctuation of the sword heart combined with the sword radiance cleverly dodged the golden light. Even when some of the golden light touched the sword radiance swayed slightly, as though it was cruising within the golden light. The speed at which the sword essence was melting was much slower than before. However, this bone-corroding golden light was too powerful. LV Ruochang was already on the verge of transforming into a sword. He already had a secret technique, but he still could not completely resist this golden light. If this continued for too long, he would still die. With LV Ruochang in such a state, the other illusory sword sect swordsmen followed LV Ruochang's earlier warning and activated their sword radiance to resist the golden light. For now, they were not in danger. Except for one person. That was the Quilted Mountain sect's Song Yuan. Song Yuan led his men into the golden destruction formation. They were not at the front in the first place. The beast cultivators and bird cultivators formed a formation in the middle of the sword formations. When the swords were flying in the formation, the beast cultivators and bird cultivators could only barely defend against the flying swords with the combined attacks that they had practiced. This way, they were at a disadvantage compared to the swordsmen who formed the sword array. Before the bone-corroding golden light landed, many of their disciples had already died. Seeing this, Song Yuan immediately transformed into his huge ape avatar. He roared as he stepped in the air, trying his best to resist the flying swords. Song Yuan's huge ape avatar was truly impressive. It had already succeeded in the soul destruction array. Within the golden destruction array, facing the tidal wave of remnant swords, black light flickered around its body. Its arms danced, and it was like 100-foot-tall wall blocking the swords. It was like a pillar protecting many beast cultivator disciples. However, when the bone-corroding golden light appeared, the golden light followed the sword and struck the huge ape's fur when the huge ape knocked the flying sword away. Sizzle. An intense sound was emitted from the point of contact between the black light and the golden light. Even the black aura that lingered around the fur started to surge under the golden light. As it surged, the black aura started to rapidly thin and fade. What made Song Yuan even more alarmed was that the black light was restrained and corroded by the golden light. A heart-wrenching, bone-piercing pain mixed with extreme itchiness emerged from his avatar. Roar! The great ape let out a furious roar. Both of its hands clenched into fists and rapidly pounded its chest. Its entire body abruptly moved in midair, causing the entire formation to tremble. Then, it charged towards the place where GMO and the others had just disappeared. Woo! The giant ape's fist carried the sound of wind as it smashed into the flying swords that were everywhere in the air. As the flying swords scattered, the golden light once again scattered. The black aura around the great ape evaporated, and the black light dissipated. Strands of bloody light gradually seeped out from under its fur. Swordsman Song Yuan. Chu Jianchong was close to the great ape. At this moment, he and a few other Grade 2 illusory swordsmen from the dazzling sword sect had formed a rhombus-shaped sword formation. Their sword auras formed a front as they tried their best to avoid the golden light. He was slightly stronger than Song Yuan. When the blood on Song Yuan's body was dripping, the golden light had just passed through their sword formation. Roar! The great ape waved its fists with all its might as if it could shatter the void. However, it couldn't drive the golden light away. This second roar was already filled with heart-wrenching pain. Pieces of its flesh were already beginning to fall apart. Song Yuan's huge body couldn't resist the golden light. Helpless, his body gradually shrank as he tried to dodge some of the golden light. However, this obviously wasn't a good plan. As the great ape shrank, its flesh had already begun to fall off. Not good. Not only was Song Yuan in danger, Chu Jianchong and the others were also in danger. After the golden light penetrated the sword formation, it immediately scattered on their swords. Their cultivation was much weaker than LV Ruochang and the others. Therefore, they couldn't maintain their sword forms where the sword light flashed. Wang! A strong sword hum was emitted from the middle of the great sword. The great sword that LV Ruochang had transformed into let out a high-pitched hum once again. The vibrations that were similar to breathing rapidly surged. The entire sword began to shake, and a strong sword aura soared into the sky. This vibration was completely different from before. It couldn't resist the golden light. Under the golden light, the great sword's radiance was rapidly corroded. Wang, Wang. Following LV Ruochang's sword hum, more than 10 great swords also hummed at the same time. Similarly, they ignored the bone-corroding golden light and began to swell. They also emitted a strong sword aura that soared into the sky. Woo! The 100,000 swordsmen who were still struggling to maintain the great sword formation were also clamoring. The sword aura emitted by the 100,000 swordsmen on the great sword formation was even more powerful. It pierced straight into the sky above the formation. Hurry up and control the formation. Xiong Huasong, who was hidden in the formation, knew that the swordsmen were going to risk their lives. He hurriedly urged GMO. At this time, besides the disciples of the 4 sects, nearly half of the disciples from the other sects had come over to resist the swordsmen together. Although they weren't very familiar with the Golden Destruction formation, under the guidance of the disciples of the 4 sects, they quickly became competent. Hearing Xiong Huasong's urging, GMO and the other 3 hurriedly waved their small banners. The dermic powers of nearly 200,000 Dao sect disciples in the Golden Destruction formation were simultaneously mobilized. A strong suction force appeared on one side of the formation, sucking in the spiritual energy of heaven and earth, sword aura, and sword intent within dozens of miles. As a huge amount of spiritual energy of heaven and earth, sword aura, and other things poured into the formation, the entire formation began to shake. Even the small banners of GMO and the other 3 emitted a golden brilliance. An uncontrollable heaviness was emitted from the small banners. GMO and the other 3's arms swayed slightly, and panic appeared on their faces. Don't panic. Xiong Huasong naturally knew that something was wrong. He hurriedly shouted, "Take your time to absorb the spiritual energy of heaven and earth, broken swords and other things. The spiritual energy of heaven and earth is easy for us cultivators to control. Those broken swords, sword aura, and sword intent belong to the swordsman for many years. They are definitely not easy to control. If you absorb too much, I'm afraid that the formation won't be able to withstand it. For now, don't absorb any more. Activate the broken swords and other things first. Fight with the swordsman and consume the sword intent. After another hour, the entire formation will close up. The dermic powers of the other 9 formations will be able to be freely transferred to the Golden Destruction formation, and we will be able to easily kill the swordsman. Boom! Another earth-shattering sound rang out, and the entire formation shook intensely. Under the combined attack of the sword cultivators, the flying swords that poured in were almost destroyed. Damn it! The small banners in the hands of GMO and the others swayed slightly, and they almost fell out of their hands. They unconsciously gritted their teeth and cursed. Strengthen the attack. Kill them a few more times, and the bone-eroding golden light will be able to exterminate them. Seeing the powerful counterattack of the sword cultivators, Xueqi was also furious. When GMO and the others heard this, they hurriedly waved the small banners again. A huge amount of metal element spiritual chi of heaven and earth poured in even more intensely, and the entire formation let out a slight rumbling sound again. Xueqi raised his eyebrows, as if he wanted to warn GMO and ask them to stop absorbing the metal element spiritual chi of heaven and earth. However, nearly 100,000 swordsmen once again released sword aura, rushing straight into the air and colliding with the dozens of flying swords. They rushed towards the incoming flying swords like a tide. This time it was different. When the sword aura of Lu Ruochang and the others made contact with the flying swords, they immediately guarded an area and began to rotate. In addition, when the sword aura of the 100,000 swordsmen made contact with the rotating sword aura, it instantly retreated. This retreating force immediately produced a strong suction force, and actually formed a huge whirlpool. The suction force was so great and so wide. It was like a giant hand was grabbing all the flying swords, but it was also like a net. It rapidly passed through these flying swords, rushed into the formation through the sword intent, and extended out of the formation. The swordsman's ability to control the metal element spiritual chi of heaven and earth and sword intent was clearly far superior to the Dao Sect swordsman. Woo! A suction force even stronger than when GMO and the others were controlling the formation was produced from the formation. An even greater amount of heaven and earth spiritual chi of heaven and earth, as well as the broken swords and other objects, surged towards the formation. What are they doing? Are they going to throw themselves into a dead end? GMO didn't understand and muttered very strangely. Not good. Quick, seal the formation. Xueqi was the most familiar with the 10-direction annihilation formation. When he saw the entire golden annihilation formation tremble with the influx of metal element spiritual chi of heaven and earth, he already understood what the swordsmen were thinking. He hurriedly said, "These damned swordsmen are relying on the sword tomb's metal element spiritual chi of heaven and earth and the flying swords to break my golden annihilation formation. Woo! Hundreds of thousands of swordsmen, 200,000 swordsmen. They were simultaneously extracting the metal element spiritual chi of heaven and earth from the sword tomb. At the same time, they were simultaneously extracting the metal element spiritual chi of heaven and earth from the sword tomb. The 10-direction annihilation formation immediately exceeded the limits of what it could withstand. The golden annihilation formation rumbled, and the surrounding restrictions instantly began to collapse. Seeing this, Xueqi expression became extremely ugly. He clapped his hands, and dozens of array flags appeared in his hands. He spat a mouthful of blood essence on them, and the array flags glowed with a 10-colored brilliance. Go! Xueqi waved his hands, and a golden array flag flew into the air, flying towards the collapsing restrictions. However, before the array flag could fly one zhong away, Gotcha! A sound like the sky being torn apart resounded through the air. The golden annihilation formation's restrictions finally collapsed under the combined efforts of both sides. This golden annihilation formation was finally destroyed under LV Ruochang's scheme. Humph! Xueqi swept his gaze across and saw that the swordsman's sword light had dimmed. He knew that they had expended a lot of energy for this scheme. He coldly snorted and ordered, "Fellow Taoist GMO, mobilize all the disciples and activate their magic power at the same time." Yes. GMO originally wanted to ask if they still needed to repair this golden annihilation formation, but the word stopped at the tip of his tongue. The small flag in his hand danced without hesitation. Chapter 2649. Xiong Huasong waved his hand, and all the formation flags flew out. He sneered, "Since you want the bone-corroding golden light, I'll give it to you all at once." As more than 10 array flags entered the formation, the golden annihilation formation collapsed even faster. However, the golden light became even stronger. Under the push of the 200,000 cultivators, the golden light poured onto the snow-like sword light like a torrential downpour. Charge! Lu Ruochang and the others were overjoyed. They knew that the golden destruction formation had indeed been broken, and this was their only chance to charge into the 10-direction annihilation formation. Even if the Dao sect cultivators summoned thousands of golden lights, they did not hesitate to send out their illusory swords. Dozens of giant swords flew at the front, followed by the giant swords formed by 100,000 swordsmen. The remaining half of the beast cultivators and bird cultivators flew at the back and rushed into the golden light together. Whoosh! It was definitely boiling water falling on snow. The moment the bone-corroding golden light came into contact with the sword light, it became even stronger than before. More than half of the sword light was instantly destroyed. All the illusory swordsmen who had transformed into swords could no longer maintain their sword forms and gradually revealed their true forms. As for the swordsmen who were lucky enough to survive, they wailed and died in a bloody mess in front of the golden destruction formation's restriction. Rumble. With the sound of the earth collapsing, as tens of thousands of swordsmen escaped, the golden destruction formation finally collapsed completely. The 10-colored light screen in the air was also torn apart, and the light spot in the center reappeared. After the light spot flashed 9 times, it turned into 9 meteors and fell separately. Where the meteors fell, the sky was torn apart, revealing the rainy night sky outside the formation. Drops of rain fell and hit the formation. The 9 meteors landed on the 9 great arrays. At this time, the 9 great arrays slowly stopped moving. When the meteors completely landed, the brilliance of the 9 arrays disappeared, revealing the original appearance of the sword tomb. Fellow Taoist Xiong. In the heavy rain, Hung Zhao's body flashed with a protective golden light. He hurriedly shouted, "This formation has been broken by the sword cultivators?" Xiong Huasong's face was filled with surprise. He pointed at the sword cultivators whose backs could still be seen and said, "That's right, the 10-direction annihilation formation of the Black Heaven sect has finally been broken. I really didn't expect that there would be sword cultivators who are proficient in Dao sect's formations. The strongest part of a formation is often the most vulnerable part of the formation. Although I've heard of this in the past, I've never dared to try it. I didn't expect to encounter it today. To be honest, I didn't even notice this part when I set up the formation. I was only thinking of how to hide the formation's formation. I never noticed this layer." When Hung Feng heard Xiong Huasong's explanation, his face was also filled with shock. Although he did not know much about spirit arrays, he understood the principles of spirit arrays. He could not help but exclaim, in that case, this idea of breaking the spirit array was thought of by a sword cultivator? That's impossible. In this old man's opinion, I'm afraid that they were just blind cats running into dead mice, right? How is that possible? Xiong Huasong shook his head decisively. If these sword cultivators charge into the water destruction formation under LV Ruochang's lead and find this flaw within the formation, then I can still agree with fellow Taoist Hang Ming's thoughts. However, LV Ruochang suddenly turned to the golden destruction formation before entering the water destruction formation. She must have thought of something. Fellow Taoist Hang Ming, don't forget that LV Ruochang escaped from the golden destruction formation. She stared at the formation eye for a long time in the center of the formation. She must have been thinking. However, Xiong Huasong said proudly, "So what if LV Ruochang could see the flaw? I'm already very satisfied to be able to kill nearly half of the sword cultivators. After all, this formation is incomplete, and I was ordered to set it up in a hurry." Hung Heng nodded slightly. He knew very well that it had only been a short time since he had discussed the formation with Xiong Huasong in the meeting hall of the Sky Patrol City. At that time, all the gold core cultivators did not pay much attention to it. He did not expect that it would come in handy today. Just now, Hung Ming saw that Xiong Huasong added fuel to the fire. He used the collapse of the golden destruction formation to increase the bone-corroding golden light. Not only did he kill Tsong Yuan, a third-grade illusory sword beast cultivator, but he also killed several second-grade and first-grade illusory swordsmen. Most of the beast cultivators and bird cultivators couldn't escape from the final blow. The number of sword cultivators who could escape from the Golden Destruction Formation was definitely not more than 70,000. Although this was a little different from what he had imagined, and they were not completely annihilated, it was still a great victory. Xiong Huasong could be proud. The rain poured down like a torrential downpour. This rain was only light before the battle, but as the 10-direction annihilation formation absorbed the spiritual energy of heaven and earth, the Sword Tomb's astronomical phenomenon was also triggered. The endless dark clouds and torrential rain began to wreak havoc in the Sword Tomb. He was a third-grade illusory swordsman and could not even be defeated by a golden core cultivator in the conference hall. However, he was killed by the bone-corroding golden light in this golden annihilation array. Thinking of that irresistible bone-corroding golden light, LV Ruochang clenched her teeth and her heart was filled with resentment. She really wanted to die for Tsang Yuan. Qian Mao. At this moment, LV Ruochang could not help but think of the leader of the Imperial Thunder Sect who self-destructed in front of her. He was a mid-stage golden core cultivator who could have escaped with his life. LV Ruochang did not understand what Qian Mo said that day. However, every word, every tear, every sentence, every word seemed to be engraved in her heart, as if they were specially said for her today. I would rather self-destruct. LV Ruochang even groaned softly. I am not willing to return to the sword domain. It was an absolute humiliation. Junior sister LV Ruoling was flying not far from LV Ruochang. This attentive third-grade illusory swordswoman was extremely sensitive to LV Ruochang's murmur. Although she did not know what LV Ruochang was talking about, she still said, "We have to be alert to prevent the Dao sect cultivators from chasing after us." See. At this point, an indescribable pain came from her body. Even a powerful illusory swordswoman like Ruoling could not help but cry out softly. The bone-corroding golden light was really amazing. The swords of the surviving illusory swordsmen had long been pierced by the golden light, and much of their flesh and blood had been lost. However, this kind of injury, Ruoling and the others had not experienced it for many years. The flashing sword lights around them blocked the rain, but what they could not block was the unhealed pain in their bodies. Chasing after us? LV Ruochang smiled bitterly, but her divine will still involuntarily swept back. Her divine will could not go very far, so she turned her head back to look. However, when she looked back, she could not help but groan softly. Ouch! Her injury was only deeper than Ruoling's. Moreover, when she was in the center of the 10-direction annihilation formation, although she looked calm and indifferent as she described the bone-corroding golden light, she had not fully recovered from the injury she had suffered in the 10-direction annihilation formation. When the golden light brushed past her for the second time, although she had the protection of the sword heart mystic skill, when the golden light attacked her from both inside and outside, her body showed signs of collapsing. Chapter 2650. LV Ruochang knew that if another golden core cultivator tried to stop her, she would not even be able to transform into a sword. Behind the tens of thousands of sword cultivators, under the pitch-black night sky, the drizzle that seemed to connect heaven and earth emitted a strange white color. From time to time, there would be wails and explosions, but there was no trace of the Dao sect cultivators chasing after them. LV Ruochang knew that this was the most realistic situation, but she still felt that she was lucky. However, this luck was strangled by her as soon as it was born. She said, "Senior Sister Ruoling, the Dao sect cultivators have won a great victory and killed us to such a miserable state. They have some brains. They will definitely not chase after us." Ruoling naturally knew that the cultivators would not chase after them. She just wanted to comfort LV Ruochang. She smiled and said, "Who knows? In this great battle of sword cultivators, the Golden Core cultivators in the meeting hall of Sky Patrol City have done many ridiculous things and killed many cultivators. Even if they chase after us, even if it is really the skull of a Jurassic beast, I will still believe it." Ha ha ha, Elvering's heart warmed and she could not help but laugh. Her smile was extremely beautiful, like the blossoming of a crystal-clear ice sculpture on an iceberg. LV Genu. The cultivators really caught up. Zhu Chengye, who was dozens of feet away from them, did not want to participate in the conversation between the two female swordsmen. He had complaints about LV Ruochang in his heart, but when he involuntarily looked back, he could not help but shout in shock. How is this possible? LV Ruocheng really did not dare to believe it, but she could not help but look back. When she saw that the night sky, which was still pitch black just now, was now flashing with the brilliance of some Dharma treasures, an absolutely unbelievable feeling surged in her heart. This is really unbelievable. LV Ruocheng could not express it in words. Were the Dao sect cultivators that stupid? Were they that greedy for credit? Was he really so vicious and merciless? Could the Dao sect cultivators be blamed? Just as Hang Ming was hesitating, Ji Hongfei from the Clear Leaf sect came over and looked at the two people standing in the air with a frown. She said anxiously, "Daoist Hang Ming, the sword cultivators have already escaped from the 10-direction annihilation formation. Why are you still standing here?" At this point, he seemed to have realized something and said to Xiong Huasong in surprise, "Could it be that fellow Daoist Xiong still has a backup plan?" Backup plan? Xiong Huasong used all of his means. Xiong Huasong said with a bitter smile, "This Xiong Grand Array was defeated by LV Ruocheng. Then what are you waiting for?" Ji Hong said angrily, "Right now, the sword cultivators are like birds startled by the twang of a bow. We are going to march north and kill them all." "This isn't appropriate, right?" Hung Ju's eyes narrowed, and he said with a smile, "Don't chase a cornered enemy. This is a principle that hasn't changed since ancient times. Furthermore, we are in the depths of the sword catacomb, which is not our forte. If we kill a few more sword cultivators, our Dao sex cultivators will also suffer more losses. It's not worth it." "Humph, if you won't chase, then I will. I don't care about other people's lives, but today, I must take that slut Lu Ruocheng's head." Ji Hong was enraged. She shouted, "You didn't see Dao friend Qian Mo's death. He was forced to his death by LV Ruocheng. In order for us to escape safely, he was willing to self-destruct. I have already thought it through. I must kill LV Ruocheng in this life to avenge Dao friend Qian Mo. Today, LV Ruocheng was heavily injured in the Golden Destruction Array. As long as I see her, I will immediately kill her." "Good." Hung Ju had long been waiting for Ji Hong's words. He clapped his hands and said, "Since Dao friend Ji has such ambition, and we have such a blood feud with the swordsman, how can I not allow it? Then, for Dao friend Qian Mo's death, for the hundreds of thousands of fallen disciples, I will give the order. Other than the injured disciples, the rest of the disciples will listen to my command and head to the depths of the sword catacomb. To kill the swordsman. We must kill them all. Yes, we must take LV Ruocheng's head as a sacrifice to Dao friend Qian Mo." Ji Hong shouted. Xiong Huasong frowned slightly and said softly, "LV Ruocheng is the leader of the sword cultivators. I'm afraid it won't be easy to kill her." "Dao friend Xiong, are you afraid? Do you want the hundreds of thousands of fallen Dao sect disciples to die in vain?" Ji Hong said coldly, "If you don't go, we won't bicker with you. You set up this array and have already made a great contribution. Naturally, you don't have to follow us." "Ha ha ha, am I the kind of person who is afraid of death?" Xiong Huasong laughed loudly. "Go go go. We will chase after them and kill LV Ruocheng." Ji Hong's brows relaxed. She waved her hand and said, "Clear Leaf sect disciples, follow me to chase after the swordsman." Yes, at this moment, only a small portion of the Clear Leaf sect disciples suffered from the backlash of the Golden Destruction Array and were recuperating. The majority of the disciples were in high morale. When they heard Ji Hong's words, they all responded. Hung Ju wasn't the slightest bit annoyed that Ji Hong had stolen the limelight. Instead, he looked at Xiong Huasong and said, "Dao friend Xiong, you are in charge of this 10-direction annihilation array. Give the order to attack on behalf of I." "Yes, Dao friend Hang Ming." Xiong Huasong didn't hesitate. Although he didn't explicitly say that they could chase after the swordsman, he didn't think much of it. The swordsman had already been killed by the array. How could they still have a chance to turn the tables? After he gave the order, many Dao sect cultivators immediately got into formation. Before long, they chased after LV Ruocheng and the others. Just as Hung Ju was about to fly up, Tai Ching Sec's Dasun hurriedly flew over and said loudly, "Dao friend Hang Ming, don't chase after a cornered enemy." Xiong Huasong glanced at him and ignored him. He activated his flying technique and flew towards the disciples who were in formation. Hung Ju looked at the anxious Dasun and helplessly recounted what Ji Hong had said. He smiled bitterly and said, I was also forced onto this path. If I don't chase after them, wouldn't I be letting down Dao friend Qian Mo? Moreover, the clear leaf sect disciples are also in danger. I can only chase after them. Sigh. But if you chase after them, it's also dangerous. Desun smiled bitterly as well. He was just short of scolding Ji Hong for having long hair and short knowledge. We have to weigh the two and choose the lesser. Hung Ju said in a low voice. Even if the swordsmen want to retaliate, they only have about 70,000 disciples. We can drown them with our saliva. Forget it. We were also forced onto the pirate ship. Desun looked at Hang Ju and said with a double meaning, for Qian Mo's death from the Imperial Thunder Sect. Yes, sometimes, there are some things that we have no choice but to do. Hung Ju nodded. In Ai's opinion, even if a nascent soul master was here, he would also make such a decision. That's right. Desun didn't say much. He hurriedly turned around and urged the disciples to chase after the swordsman. Chapter 2651. How is this possible? LV Ruochong, who was in the distance, was in disbelief. She was so grateful that she almost wanted to kneel on the ground. If she knew that Ji Hong was the one behind this, she might even cut off a chicken's head and burn yellow paper to become sworn sisters with Ji Hong. Quick! We will slow down immediately. LV Ruochong was just about to give the order, but her gaze fell on the panicked swordsmen. These swordsmen were completely like... Oh no, it was like they were defeated. Why was there a need to pretend? Why bother slowing down? LV Ruochong looked up at the night sky in front of her. She clapped her hands and took out a flying sword. She activated the sword origin and the flying sword shot into the distance like a ray of light. In less than half a meal's worth of time, another flying sword flew back. LV Ruochong received the flying sword and inspected it. A smile appeared at the corner of her mouth, while traces of coldness flashed in her eyes. When she turned her head to look at the gradually approaching brilliance of the Dharma treasure in the distance, and then looked at Zhu Qingye and Rua Ling who were close by, she did not say anything. She only stretched out her right index finger, which swayed left and right in the air. It was spotlessly white and flawless, emitting a faint sword light in the night. Almost 70,000 swordsmen panicked when they saw the cultivators chasing after them. Naturally, there was no lack of intelligent people. They immediately thought of the sword slip that LV Ruochong had used before they were trapped in the formation. They thought of the four-direction sword formation that LV Ruochong had mentioned earlier and were immediately energized. Regardless of whether they knew what was going on or not, all the swordsmen fled in the direction of the four-direction sword formation that LV Ruochong had painstakingly set up over the years. The hundreds of thousands of Dao sect cultivators behind did not expect that the already dead poisonous snake would raise its head and give them a fatal blow. The battle between Dao cultivators should have ended naturally at this point. However, due to a freak combination of factors and the unpredictability of a person's heart, there was an earth-shattering change. Anyone who could watch from a high position would definitely sigh at the fickleness of the world. But who would watch from a high position? Even Xiao Hua, who was high up, did not have the ability to observe the battle from a single glance. At this moment, Xiao Hua was trapped in the maze of the four-direction sword formation in midair. He sat cross-legged with a frown on his face and a bitter smile on his face. Alas, this matter is truly beyond this young master's expectations. Xiao Hua sighed. The metal escape technique is far more complicated than this young master had imagined. It was actually divided into low, middle, and high grades. The low grade could travel within the metal equipment, the middle grade could travel with the help of the metal energy, and the high grade could travel with the help of the metal energy in places where the metal energy was extinguished. This young master is truly ignorant and inexperienced, simply a frog in a well. In the past, this young master had cultivated the earth escape, fire escape, and wood escape. This young master felt that this young master was free wherever he went. But now, it seems that these three escape techniques are only low-level techniques. If I truly want to be free and unfettered within the five elements, I must cultivate the five elements escape techniques to the extreme. Alas, now I know. Where did the path of cultivation come from? As long as there was a passageway, it would be good enough. How many capable people in this world are there? Although they have extraordinary aptitudes, they do not have the opportunity to cultivate. What can they do in their lifetime? Xiao Hua sighed with emotion. Now that this young master has obtained the metal escape technique, I have already obtained 4 of the 5 elements escape techniques. If I can find the water escape technique, I will be able to complete it. Won't I be 100 times stronger than them? Let's see, it's not just the water escape technique. Even the metal escape technique, the wood escape technique, and the fire escape technique need to be of a higher grade. The 5 elements escape techniques are not easy to gather. But the wind escape technique with perhaps in the future I will have the opportunity to obtain an even higher grade technique from the Empress. As for the truly complete escape technique, it is still my Imperial Thundersex Thunder escape technique. Thinking of this, Xueqi smiled again. This young master's thunder escape technique feels like it has reached a kind of extreme. If I cultivate a little more, I should be able to catch up with the Imperial Thundersex Sect Master. Don't tell me this young master has the potential to run away. Actually, this wasn't the first time Xueqi had this thought. The thunder escape technique was an extremely difficult technique to cultivate in the Imperial Thunder Sect, and was even harder to cultivate than Foundation Establishment, Golden Core, and Nascent Soul techniques. But in Xueqi's hands, this thunder escape technique was simply tailor-made for him. He didn't need to work too hard. As long as he progressed step by step, he could easily advance. If this were to get out, it would really be stupefying. It was precisely because of this that when Xueqi disguised himself as Wu Ming from the Imperial Thunder Sect and used thunder escape technique, no one would associate this Wu Ming with Xueqi, who was at the middle Foundation Establishment stage. At that moment, Xueqi's heart stirred again, and his mind entered the space. That wisp of primordial spirit that was using the sword escape technique seemed to have comprehended something. Mother! Goldie sensed Xueqi entering the space, and called out very gently. Xueqi replied, then looked at Little Silver, who was jumping between the spirit grasses. This guy still had half a spirit grass left in his mouth, and the emerald juice stained his lips green. Seeming to sense Goldie's respect, Little Silver also hurriedly stopped on a spirit grass. It was just that the spirit grass was too thin for Little Silver's small body to support it. With a plop, Little Silver fell to the ground, then flipped over and climbed to his feet. His tiny tail flicked nimbly over his body, and some of the dust on it was shaken off. Xueqi smiled slightly. Looking at the space that hadn't changed much, he paused in midair and carefully comprehended what that wisp of primordial spirit had gained. This primordial spirit sword controlling technique is indeed correct. After all, tempering the primordial spirit can strengthen it to the point where it can control spells and magic treasures in the space. After a long while, Xueqi already understood that this sword escape technique was fundamentally a technique to strengthen the primordial spirit. Only when the primordial spirit was stronger than that of an ordinary swordsman would they have the strength to control a flying sword. Of course, Xueqi had already obtained Li Xiaobai's primordial spirit strengthening technique before. It was just that the previous primordial spirit strengthening technique was to nurture the primordial spirit from an infant to a child, while this secret technique was to nurture the child to adulthood, and even teach the adult how to wield a spear. Primordial spirit strengthening technique? Xueqi suddenly quivered, and a question that he hadn't thought about carefully before appeared in his mind. This young master's primordial spirits are now 10. Although they are all weak, they each have their own affairs and responsibilities, and everything is in order. It's just that if all 10 primordial spirits grow up and become stronger in the future, who will be the master and who will be the assistant? Don't tell me. Xueqi will be divided into 10 parts? Thinking this, Xueqi felt himself break out in a cold sweat. Naturally, his mind was now in the space, so how could there be cold sweat? There must be a primordial spirit to strengthen, and this primordial spirit must be far stronger than the other primordial spirits. Xueqi immediately made a decision, but then he was in a dilemma. Which primordial spirit needs to be strengthened? The one to comprehend the heavenly Tao? The one to comprehend the hand of karma? For a moment, Xueqi was extremely hesitant, not knowing how to choose. But just as Xueqi was about to think carefully, a sense of vigilance came from outside. Damn it, this bastard Yutong really wants to kill me. This young master's metal escape technique is just a beginner. How can I use it to run away? Xueqi immediately understood that this was Yutong attacking him outside of the capital star array and the innate true water. He didn't have time to think too much, and his mind immediately left the space, leaving the primordial spirit to continue practicing the primordial spirit strengthening technique. Xueqi opened his eyes and saw the incomplete capital heavenly star array protecting him. Outside of the capital heavenly star array, the azure innate true water rippled and flowed silently. Countless tiny bubbles floated in the water in an indescribable trajectory. It was as if each bubble was a complete dimension, and each dimension contained a tragic story. Although the innate true water was created by Xueqi, he didn't dare to look at it too much, for fear that he would lose his mind if he wasn't careful. Boom! A drum-like sound came from outside the innate true water. Although the sound was extremely weak, Xueqi knew that it was the loud sound of Yutong activating the Buddhist golden array. Did this bastard think of a way to break the array? Xueqi was slightly surprised. After waiting for a while, he didn't see any strange movements from the innate true water. He couldn't help but activate the Buddha Sarira, and a small crack appeared in the innate true water. Through the crack, Xueqi could clearly see that outside the room was still flickering with silver light, and Yutong was nowhere to be seen. Boom! Another loud sound rang out, and it was as if the entire space was shaking. Xueqi's heart skipped a beat, and an extremely bad feeling emerged from his heart. Forget it, let's run first. Xueqi's eyes turned, and he silently grabbed with his hand, and the dozens of talismans flew into the space. Then, he activated the Buddha Sarira and used the clear water bottle to store the innate true water. He looked around, and then flew in a certain direction. When he reached the silver wall, he closed his eyes and started chanting. It's just that if Xueqi's incantation was heard by other people, perhaps they would lose their big teeth again. But they heard him recite, "May the deities and Buddhas all over the sky bless this kid. This is the first time this kid has used the metal evasion technique. Don't disappoint this kid. Any immortal who passes by, please open your eyes. This young master is a disciple of the Imperial Lightning Sect, and this young master is about to use it." After these few sentences, the real mantra began. When Xueqi formed the mantra, his body flashed with a faint silver light, and Xueqi slammed into the silver wall. Dong! The sound traveled far, but Xueqi didn't enter the wall. Instead, he frowned and touched his forehead. The force of this collision was too strong. Fortunately, Xueqi's skin was rough, and his flesh was far thicker than an ordinary person's. A small dent appeared on the wall, and Xueqi's head didn't have a bump. After thinking for a moment, Xueqi tried again, but to his surprise, this metal escape technique was indeed somewhat interesting. Of course, it could also be that Xueqi was too impatient and didn't completely comprehend it. Xueqi actually slammed into the wall more than 10 times, but he still couldn't enter it. Chapter 2652. Fortunately, Xueqi was the only cultivator in the maze of the Buddhist Gold Great Array. If it was seen by others, wouldn't Xueqi be regarded as a madman? If Xueqi was like a madman, then in the huge square inside the Buddhist Gold Great Array, Yutong, wearing a silver robe and disheveled hair, was really a madman. However, there was no trace of people on the square at this time. It seemed that all the disciples of the fallen Gold Mountain had been sent back to the family by Yutong. However, even so, the layout of the square still had some changes. The passages had long disappeared, and the whole square was seamless. It was not much different from the small grid of Xueqi's previous. In front of Yutong were 2 sword gourds. However, at this time, the silver light cocoons on the 2 sword gourds had disappeared. Even the scarlet red and azure colors were tightly attached to the surface of the sword gourds, not far away. However, what was different from before was that these 2 sword gourds were slowly rotating in a circle in the air. One was chasing the other, while the other was chasing the one in front. It was as if there was an endless attraction and repulsion between the 2 sword gourds. Yutong was not idle either. Above his head, the silver tiger Dharma body had already appeared. It had a pair of fleshy wings, and its fist-sized eyes flashed with a silver-white brilliance as it stared fixedly at the 2 sword gourds that were constantly changing. These 2 sword gourds had been rotating like this for a day and night, but there was no change in the speed and trajectory. Yutong's feet were using a mysterious footwork, and his body was flashing with a silver brilliance. The brilliance changed slightly with his footwork, like the swaying seaweed in the sea. At the same time, the true essence around Yutong's body surged, and some strange spells were launched. However, the strange thing was that these spells did not fall on the 2 sword gourds, but on the trajectory of the sword gourds. As the spell was inserted, layers of silver light appeared on the path. This light was absorbed by the sword gourd from time to time, but this silver light wasn't absorbed by the sword gourd. It only landed on the surface of the sword gourd and condensed with the red and azure lights. Gradually, the red and azure lights on the sword gourd faded. Roar, seeing that the color on the two sword gourds had faded, the silver tiger above Yutong's head roared angrily. It spread its wings and pounced toward the two sword gourds. It opened its mouth and spat out a silver-white breath onto the two sword gourds. Buzz! The two sword gourds let out an ear-piercing sword hum at the same time. The sword hum was even louder than the giant swords that Lu Ruochong and the others had transformed into. In an instant, Yutong and the silver tiger were sent flying more than 30 meters away. Yutong seemed to be prepared. As soon as his figure flew out, he immediately flew back. There was a slight joy on his face, but his eyes were still extremely calm, as if this was how it should be. When Yutong's figure appeared in front of the sword gourd again, the sword gourd was no longer as quiet as before. After the sword hum, it began to surge rapidly, and the entire sword gourd began to fluctuate. Quick! The joy on Yutong's face disappeared and was replaced by a trace of seriousness. The spell in his hands changed again. Both hands were using the same spell, and they hit the two sword gourds at the same time. Buzz buzz buzz. A low sword hum like a bee came from the two sword gourds at the same time, and the changes in the two sword gourds gradually disappeared. Then they began to vibrate. The rhythm was different at first, but it gradually became the same. Pooh! Seeing that the rhythm of the two sword gourds was the same, at that moment, Yutong opened his mouth and spat out a mouthful of essence blood, which landed on the two sword gourds. The essence blood touched the sword gourds and immediately sank into them, disappearing without a trace. Yutong's body emitted a bright silver light again, and his scattered hair flew straight up. Quick! The spell that Yutong had been using for a long time immediately landed on the two sword gourds. Buzz! The two sword gourds let out a high-pitched sword hum at the same time. In fact, the crimson and azure light that had long faded bloomed again. However, at this time, the crimson and azure light only occupied half of the brilliance, and the other half was silver-white brilliance. Yutong's figure naturally retreated a few meters, but before he could stabilize himself, Yutong stretched out his hands. The silver-white brilliance on his hands covered the sword gourds. Then, as Yutong slowly closed his hands, the silver-white brilliance on the two sword gourds also slowly approached. Buzz buzz! As if resisting this approach, the two sword gourds let out a sword hum. Roar! In just a moment, the brilliance around Yutong's body dimmed, and sweat faintly appeared on his forehead. Almost without thinking, his true tiger dharma flapped its wings, and several silver-white brilliance hit the sword gourds, and the two sword gourds moved a little more. Pu. The two sword gourds seemed to be extremely repelled. Yutong's true tiger dharma had no choice but to open its mouth again and spit out several silver-white breaths in a row, trying to put the two sword gourds together. However, there was just a small gap, and the sword gourds couldn't touch each other. Roar! Yutong's body was already trembling slightly. The true tiger dharma body let out another roar and spat out a breath of air that was much dimmer than before. The two sword calabashes moved slightly, but there was no effect. At this time, Yutong was a little hesitant, and his brows were tightly furrowed, as if he was thinking about something. But in the blink of an eye, the scarlet and azure brilliance on the two sword gourds swelled slightly, and a great force was generated, and the gap that was thinner than a strand of hair actually widened a little. Not good. Seeing that his previous efforts were about to be wasted, Yutong gritted his teeth, and the silver-white brilliance on his body disappeared, and then a dark green color gradually appeared. Woo! A strange sound came from Yutong's mouth, and 9 balls of light that were extremely similar to the green seal script emerged from his forehead, and quickly circled the two sword gourds a few times, and then completely disappeared into the sword gourds. The sword gourds' brilliance didn't resist the green light at all. Combine! Yutong said with great difficulty. The two sword gourds collided, and a surge of sword brilliance rushed out from the point of contact, directly piercing into the silver-white canopy of the Brahma Gold Formation. Yutong seemed to have used up all of his magic power, and his silver-white Taoist robes were soaked in sweat. The true tiger's avatar couldn't hold on any longer, and with a howl, it fell into Yutong's body. The sword brilliance split open a huge crack in the silver-white canopy, and then disappeared. The scarlet and azure brilliance of the sword gourds quickly overflowed, and between the two colors was an extremely large amount of silver-white and a few strands of dark green. Of course, the few strands of gold under the dark green weren't very clear, or perhaps the exhausted Yutong couldn't see it at all. The scarlet and azure brilliance fluctuated for a long time, and gradually settled down like the liquid of a pill. Between the scarlet and azure brilliance was a silver-white brilliance, and at this time, the dark green had disappeared without a trace. Ai, Yutong sighed, and used his hand to wipe away the sweat on his forehead. He softly muttered to himself, although this Yutong has the silver tiger bloodline, and his body is naturally stronger than ordinary cultivators, but it can't be considered useful. I still have to refine it more in the future. Unfortunately, this little lord's secret technique can only be used once. It seems this little lord won't be able to cultivate the embryonic form of the spirit-slaying origin light today. With that, Yutong reached out his hand and took out a spirit pill. He put it in his mouth and sat down cross-legged. Silver light flashed around his body as he began to adjust his breathing. The two sword gourds in front of Yutong were connected together. The two lights intertwined and spun, overflowing with each other as if they had already fused together. After an hour, Yutong's body flashed and he stood up. He waved his hand as if he was going to put away the two sword gourds. However, when Yutong stretched out his hand, he looked a little unwilling. He bit his lips slightly and made a hand seal. His hand shook, and a silver brilliance hit the place where the sword gourd intersected. Wang, this time the sword hummed even more, but the scarlet and azure lights trembled even more. After the light faded, the two sword gourds fused even more. Ah! Yutong almost couldn't believe his eyes. A trace of astonishment flashed in his eyes, and then he became even more ecstatic. How is this possible? The fusing of the yin-yang sword gourds, the further it goes, the more difficult it is. Yours truly's secret technique was originally meant to be used here, but who would have thought that the power of this sword gourd would be so great? Even the initial fusion had to expend all of yours truly's powers, and it even required yours truly to use his secret technique. How could the subsequent fusion, which was even more difficult, be so simple? It's really incredible, really incredible. Yutong of course didn't dare to let his guard down. Chapter 2653. A silver-white halo followed Yutong's hands and fell on the sword gourd. The halo spun rapidly on the sword gourd and swept down from top to bottom. As the halo fell, the sword gourd began to emit a sword cry and tremble slightly. The crimson and azure brilliance quickly shrank and condensed into the sword gourd, turning the sword gourd into a silver-white gourd. Ha ha! Yutong saw the sword gourd turn silver-white and laughed loudly. He pointed at the mouth of the sword gourd and two sword lights, one azure and one red, rushed out from the sword gourd and pierced into the silver-white sky. Two bowl-sized holes immediately appeared in the sky. Motherfucker! This spirit-slaying Yuan light is really powerful. Although it hasn't fully formed yet, it's still very powerful. Even though it's not fully formed, this Buddhist gold great array can't block it. Yutong clicked his tongue a few times and a cold light flashed in his eyes. He looked at Xiaohua's direction and said, if the Buddhist gold great array can't block it, then the incomplete capital heavenly star's great array and the innate primordial water. I'm afraid they can't block it either. Feng-ying. Today, this young master will kill you. This young master wants to see who you are. Thinking about it, Yutong stretched out his hand, and the silver-white gourd appeared in his hand. His body slowly rose up, and a silver-white light flashed in the air, and Yutong disappeared. It was the metal escape technique that Xiaohua had painstakingly practiced. Dun, dun, dun. The monotonous yet rhythmic sound reverberated in the maze of the Buddhist gold formation. It sounded like a drum or a gong. Yutong's figure appeared from the wall not far away. He looked at Xiaohua with a strange expression. From time to time, Xiaohua's body would glow with a silvery white light, and he would rush to the wall from time to time. As Yutong appeared, Xiaohua was extremely sensitive and sensed it. He quickly turned around and saw Yutong's thoughtful eyes. Xiaohua's face turned slightly red. He raised his hand and dozens of talismans immediately appeared. He wanted to set up the capital heavenly star's great array. Seeing the familiar silver light on Xiaohua's body, Yutong seemed to have thought of something and a mocking expression appeared in his eyes. When he saw Xiaohua hurriedly setting up the formation, he didn't chase after him. Instead, he calmly watched and waited for Xiaohua to release the Xiantian primordial water. Then, he coldly smiled and said, Junior Martial Brother Feng-ying is indeed in a good mood. You're practicing the Iron Head technique. You're extremely diligent. I really admire you. Hee hee, do I need you to tell me? Do I need to inform you? Xiao Hua was a little embarrassed, but he didn't say anything. Junior brother Feng, you seem to have forgotten. Yu Tong was in an extremely good mood. He smiled and said, "This is my Buddhist gold array, and it's also my home. Don't you need to inform the master if you do something inexplicable?" Xiao Hua looked at Yu Tong's smile, puzzled. His eyes fell on the silver gourd in Yu Tong's left hand, and his face immediately showed a look of understanding. I'm leaving. As the master, don't you want to open the door? Xiao Hua bit his lip and said with narrowed eyes, "Leave? Feel free to leave." Yu Tong said with a smile, "This Yu has never forced people to stay. Could it be you weren't practicing the iron head technique just now? You were knocking on the door with your head? Your Buddhist gold great array doesn't even have a door. Do I need to knock on the door with my head?" Xiao Hua knew that Yu Tong came here with a powerful method. He was even sure that there was something wrong with the gourd, but his mind was still spinning rapidly, thinking of countermeasures. Yu Tong raised his eyebrows and said with a smile, "What? Do you want to know? What's so great about it? Isn't it just a yin-yang sword gourd?" Xiao Hua sneered, "It's not like I haven't seen it before." "Humph, you're really ignorant," Yu Tong said disdainfully, even showing off. "What yin-yang sword gourd? This is called soul-slaying vital light." Soul-slaying vital light? Xiao Hua didn't expect that Yu Tong didn't hide it at all and directly said it. When he slightly tasted it, his expression immediately changed. Was there even a need to say it? Yu Tong already thought of him as a dead person, so he took out the soul-slaying vital light and shared it with him, even teasing him with interest. "What is this soul-slaying vital light? Is it from Falling Gold Mountain? Or Washing Flower Sect?" Xiao Hua frowned, his somewhat frozen smile finally moving as he asked. "Junior brother Feng doesn't need to know." Yu Tong shook his head slightly. "If you don't want to say it, then forget it." Xiao Hua nodded. "How about this, if you want me to leave, then take this soul-slaying vital light as a farewell gift. I'll take this gourd and leave." They were right between Xiao Hua's neck, protecting him. Moreover, the moment the sword light extended, it hit the connection between the yin-yang sword qi. Kang! A sharp sound was extremely ear-piercing, like a sharp sword cutting through a hard rock. These 16 flying swords actually blocked the seemingly unstoppable yin-yang sword qi. Hissed flying sword shadow technique. How do you know?" Yu Tong sucked in a breath of cold air and almost cried out in alarm. Seeing that the Dream Executor and the Mountain Splitter had blocked the yin-yang sword spirit sword light, Xiao Hua's heart calmed down. He looked left and right at the constellation array and the innate primordial water. He clenched his hand, and dozens of rays of light flashed, putting away the constellation array. Since Yu Tong had the means to break this great array, Xiao Hua's array could only be a hindrance. Oh! After Yu Tong recovered from his shock, he saw Xiao Hua put away the array. He raised his eyebrows and said coldly, "You're just a disciple of the Huan Hua sect. How could you know such a flying sword technique? Where did you come from? Take advantage of this moment to tell me. If you have something to do with me, I may not necessarily not let you live. Moreover, you seem to have used the metal escape technique just now. Presumably, you also know the secret of the Silver Tiger magic tool. How could an ordinary cultivator discover the secret of the Silver Tiger magic tool in such a short time? I won't hide it from you. What I want to do is very big, and I need a lot of help. I can consider cooperating with you. The secret inside the magic tool. You can have a share." As Yu Tong spoke, the yin-yang sword spirit retreated slightly and stopped in midair. At this time, the two flying swords were very strange. The two flying swords were only about the length of a finger, and were incomparably sparkling and translucent. When one's gaze swept over the flying swords, they would appear and disappear. Even when one's divine sense was at the location, they would flicker indefinitely. They seemed to exist in midair, but also seemed to not exist in midair. Putting aside the green and red colors on the two flying swords, there were also a few strands of silvery white within the green and red colors. These green and red colors seemed to be alive. When the flying swords appeared, they moved around in an extremely orderly manner. At first glance, it was as if two eyes were showing an indescribable expression. At this time, Xiao Hua's 2 flying swords turned into 16 and lined up in front of him. They also overflowed with green and red colors, but it was very obvious that within the brilliance of the Dream Slayer and the Mountain Splitter, there was an abundance of baleful aura but not enough nimbleness. While listening to Yutong's persuasion, Xiao Hua's divine sense swept over the yin-yang sword spirit. He inwardly sighed that the yin-yang sword spirit, which was refined by Yu Qingtian and Zhang Yuha's souls and sacrificed with the blood of nearly 100,000 creatures, was indeed fierce. At the same time, he inwardly pondered. He was somewhat puzzled by Yutong's words. What do you mean it has something to do with him? What do you mean by ordinary cultivators can't see through the secret of this magic tool? Could it be this guy already knew about the legacy realm mentioned in the magic tool? However, as a rogue cultivator, Xiao Hua had long heard this kind of affectionate persuasion to stay countless times. He had long seen this kind of heartfelt persuasion. Among these persuasion, which one of them wasn't temporary? Which one of them wasn't a contest of strength? Humph, if I leave this formation. Xiao Hua coldly snorted. Would I still be afraid of you? However, Xiao Hua slightly changed his mind. When he thought of this, how could Yutong, who had been scheming against Zhang Yuha for dozens of years, not know? He definitely wouldn't be at ease if he left. Moreover, when he thought about how Yutong and the others treated the 100,000 creatures as nothing and wantonly hunted them in order to increase their cultivation, even if he wanted to cooperate with someone, he absolutely wouldn't choose them. Ha ha, with this thought, Xiao Hua burst into laughter. I don't care what kind of bullshit person you are. I don't want to have any relationship with you. Previously, I avoided the battle because I didn't want to be nosy. Now that you insist on forcing me to make a move, don't blame me for being ruthless. Ha ha ha. Yutong's laughter seemed to be louder than Xiao Hua's. He also looked at Xiao Hua with interest and even said somewhat arrogantly, "Little guy, who doesn't know how to be overbearing. But you also need to have strength. Don't think that just because you know how to transform flying swords into shadows, you can be arrogant in front of me. I'll let you see what the soul-slaying primary light is." As he spoke, 2 flying swords as thin as cicada's wings suddenly let out a rumbling sound. Yutong didn't seem to activate any spells, but they stabbed towards Xiao Hua. That kind of indescribable sharpness immediately pierced between Xiao Hua's eyebrows. Who's afraid of you? Xiao Hua pointed his finger. The 16 flying swords also moved in the air. There was some mysterious connection between them. Their flying speed was extremely fast, blocking in front of the oncoming yin-yang sword light. Whoosh, the green-red yin-yang sword light really did have intelligence. As if playing hide-and-seek, it casually weaved between the 16 flying swords. In the blink of an eye, it dodged the attacks of the Soul Slayer and the Mountain Slayer, and once again approached Xiao Hua. Humph, Xiao Hua's hand seals changed again. Whoosh whoosh whoosh, a series of sounds rang out. 32, 64, and finally 128 sword lights flew out and blocked in front of the yin-yang sword light with extreme speed. Hehe, as expected, you have some skill. Yutong beamed with joy. This was the first time Xiao Hua had used 2 flying swords. 128 sword lights. At first, these 100 sword lights were somewhat clumsy, but following the urging of Xiao Hua's divine sense, they gradually became orderly. These sword lights even faintly formed a sword array, encircling the yin and yang sword lights. Although the 2 flying swords with intelligence were incomparably nimble, they were unable to withstand the overwhelming number of swords. For the time being, they had no way of flying out. Not bad, not bad. In the distance, Yutong actually clapped his hands and praised. The Rinsing Flower sect actually has a disciple like you. This is really beyond my expectations. Not only that, Xiao Hua raised his head and sneered. Today, I'll let you see what this young master is capable of. While speaking, Xiao Hua didn't seem to make any movements. The innate primordial water that previously surrounded Xiao Hua suddenly surged with waves. Those waves condensed in midair, and like a fist, smashed towards Yutong. Come on! Yutong shouted loudly. His shoulders shook, and the true tiger Dharmakaya was released again. Roar! The true tiger Dharmakaya roared loudly, and a pair of fleshy wings flapped. Suddenly, out of nowhere, 2 silver-white brilliances gushed out. These brilliances were like clear springs rushing towards the innate primordial water. Boom! With a loud sound, the brilliances blocked the primordial water. The primordial water fell to the ground like a huge rock, hitting the defensive silver brilliance. With a loud sound, the primordial water suddenly scattered in all directions, and the silver brilliance was also shattered into pieces. Yu Tong's Dharmakaya is powerful. Xiao Hua thought to himself, fighting in this Buddhist gold formation, he has the absolute advantage. But so what? Xiao Hua's Buddha Saraira once again activated the innate primordial water. This primordial water actually didn't condense, but instead turned into a net in midair, covering Yu Tong's head. Chapter 2655. Yu Tong's eyes flashed with astonishment. He looked at the 100 or so swords fighting with the yin and yang swords, then looked at the net of primordial water. He really didn't understand. For an ordinary golden core cultivator, controlling 100 sword lights with only his divine will was probably already his limit. Even if Xiao Hua was far more powerful than an ordinary golden core cultivator, he could still split a part of his divine will to control the innate primordial water. However, that part of his divine will could only turn the innate primordial water into waves, but now, he could actually pull the innate primordial water into a net. The difference between this net and waves was not just a little bit. A complicated expression flashed through Yu Tong's eyes. The true tiger Dharma body spat out several mouthfuls of silver light, as well as the silver light from its fleshy wings, forming layers of defense in front of the primordial water. Rumble, another earth-shattering collision sound rang out. The two of them were still evenly matched in their battle. Feng Ying. Yu Tong first called him Junior Martial Brother Feng from Martial Nephew Feng, and now he called him by his name. I'm afraid your ability ends here. This young master will ask you one last time. Do you want to submit to this young master? Ha ha ha, Yu Tong, what ability do you have? You dare to make this young master submit? At this time, Xiao Hua didn't even use his sword art. He was laughing so hard that he swayed back and forth. Without the protection of the capital star array, he simply threw caution to the wind and prepared to fight against this peak late golden core, or even early nascent soul cultivator. Yu Tong's face gradually turned ashen, looking extremely unsightly. Previously, it was extremely easy to seize the position of falling Golden Mountain sect master, and even kill Zhang Yuhe, but the satisfaction had long disappeared. He coldly snorted and said, "This sect master saw that you were a talent, so this sect master cherished talent, and wanted to use you and the others as my wings. Since you don't want to choose the path of the sun, this young master will give it to you and Zhang Yuhe." As he spoke, Yu Tong very solemnly waved his hand. His hands formed seals, and the surrounding spiritual energy of heaven and earth swarmed over. Even some sword intent and sword chi from some places of the Buddhist gold grade array were drawn over. After a moment, where the silver light flashed, a long spear about 10 feet long condensed. The spiritual energy inside the fist-thick spear shaft was so dense that it almost condensed into substance. Go! Yu Tong swung his spear as if it was light. The long spear emitted a fierce cry, swaying with a silvery white brilliance as it pierced towards Xiao Hua's chest. He had only flown a few feet when a powerful force was transmitted from the long spear. It seemed as if the surrounding air was about to be pierced through, making a chi-chi sound. Xiao Hua's eyes narrowed slightly as he looked coldly at the spear. When the spear was closer, he waved his hand and took out the wishful steel staff again. His figure swayed and flew up like a gust of wind, smashing towards the spear. Seeing Xiao Hua take out the wishful staff, Yu Tong's face showed a trace of regret. Obviously, he had forgotten about Xiao Hua's magic tool. However, this regret disappeared in a flash. Immediately after, Yu Tong's fingers moved like he was playing a pipa. A few silver-white rays of light arrived first and hit the long spear. Woo-woo! The long spear let out an extremely loud cry and suddenly transformed. Just like Xiao Hua's flying sword, it suddenly turned into 4 spears and stabbed towards Xiao Hua from 4 different angles. How could Xiao Hua be afraid of this? The wishful steel staff in his hand danced elegantly. With a series of pang-pang-pang sounds, the long spear was actually broken into pieces by Xiao Hua. The powerful force on the long spear seemed to have no effect on Xiao Hua at all. Looking at the dancing sword light, then looking at the fierce collision between the innate real water and the real tiger Dharma body, and then looking at Xiao Hua waving the wishful steel staff to fight with the long spear, Yu Tong's eyes almost fell out. He was not fighting with one person, it was simply fighting with 3 people. Is this still a Foundation establishment cultivator? Yu Tong almost groaned like everyone else and secretly smiled bitterly. But it was also because of this question that Yu Tong's eyes suddenly lit up as if he had thought of something. However, at this moment, he heard Xiao Hua's long roar and his figure skyrocketed. The wishful steel staff crossed through the air and smashed down like a mountain. It hit the 3 long spears at once. The 3 long spears flashed violently as if they were about to collapse. Explode! Yu Tong hurriedly made a secret gesture in his hand. Rumble! The 3 sounds turned into a loud bang, and the strong impact enveloped Xiao Hua. In an instant, Xiao Hua was flipped over in midair. Xiao Hua's reaction was beyond Yu Tong's expectations. Xiao Hua's figure was almost like a floating leaf in the wind. Although he was a little out of control at first, he instantly regained his balance. However, when Yu Tong saw the direction Xiao Hua was flipped in, the expression on his face changed slightly. Because Xiao Hua fell near the yin-yang sword gourd that Yu Tong had previously raised in mid-air. How dare you! Yu Tong was a little panicked. He was almost in a hurry to make a sword gesture, as if he wanted to take back the yin-yang sword gourd. Ha ha ha! This thing is kindly accepted by this young master. Although Xiao Hua had not yet approached the sword gourd, he waved his hand and used the heaven and earth technique to cover the sword gourd that was shaking in mid-air and had not been taken back by Yu Tong. Yu Tong tried his best to take it back, but Xiao Hua had already arrived. A strong confining force covered the sword gourd, and the connection between Yu Tong and the sword gourd disappeared. You. Yu Tong gritted his teeth, but Xiao Hua said with a smile, "Many thanks." But when he wrapped his mind and wanted to take the sword gourd into his space, an incomparable shock came from the sword gourd. A sharpness that was 100 times sharper than a flying sword flew out from the sword gourd's mouth and locked Xiao Hua's mind in an instant. Ah! Xiao Hua was so scared that his face turned ashen. He hurriedly withdrew his mind, but an extremely dim green-red color rushed out from the sword gourd. It was like the green-red sword light from before, and it pierced towards Xiao Hua's face. With a sharp sound, Xiao Hua's Taoist robe was shattered by this green-red color and turned into flying butterflies. Puh! With another sharp sound, the green-red sword light pierced Xiao Hua's palm that was covering the sword gourd. With a slight turn, it passed through his palm. Xiao Hua's body had been tempered thousands of times, and ordinary magic tools could not compare to it. Unexpectedly, it was easily pierced by this green-red color. Ah! The pain that he had not felt for a long time came, and Xiao Hua could not help but cry out. However, just as he cried out, the green-red color arrived at his face. Pooh! Xiao Hua did not have time to think and spat out a wisp of spirit fire. The scarlet-red color immediately flashed, and in an instant, it turned into a wisp and burned towards the green-red color. Ha ha ha! Yu Tong laughed loudly in the distance, and there was no longer the panic from before. You think this young master did not guard against this move of yours? You took this young master's ancestral magic tool, and you want to take this young master's sword gourd. You are really too greedy. This is soaring scarlet fire? How could this item appear in Dawn Rain Continent? However, just as Yu Tong was shocked, another change suddenly occurred. The green-red light that was about to be burned by the soaring scarlet fire suddenly turned back, and almost instantly fell into the sword gourd. Looking at the sword gourd again, it was the 2 drops of blood that had dripped from Xiao Hua's hand that had just been pierced. At this moment, those drops of blood had merged into the sword gourd, and a layer of light gold was born from the blood drops. On the sword gourd, a layer of dark green mixed with the silver-white color appeared and rolled towards the golden color. What is going on now? Just as this thought appeared in Yu Tong's mind, he saw that at the bottom of the sword gourd, a layer of light gold rushed out, and like Xiao Hua's drop of blood, it attacked the dark green and the silver-white color. Yu Tong suddenly remembered, this sword gourd seemed to be Xiao Hua's from the beginning. Xiao Hua saw the green-red light shrink into the sword gourd. How could he not know that he had secretly done something to this sword gourd? The true essence in his meridians immediately rushed out, and the refined spell smashed towards the sword gourd with full force. You dare! Seeing the golden light on the sword gourd, Yu Tong was even more furious. As his figure flew, he slapped his hand, and the pressure of a late gold core stage immediately pressed down on Xiao Hua. Bitter! In fact, Xiao Hua was most afraid of this pressure. Without the support of the Phoenix celestial body, he was definitely not the opponent of Yu Tong's pressure. Seeing the pressure coming, the true essence in his body began to stagnate. Chapter 2656. What should I do? Xiao Hua's mind turned sharply. He wanted to take out the wishful steel staff to see if he could defeat this pressure. However, he was firmly suppressed by the spiritual sense and pressure. It was very obvious that Yu Tong's spiritual sense was not an ordinary cultivator. He must also have some kind of secret technique. Damn it! Today, this young master has really met his nemesis. Xiao Hua, who was trapped in a hopeless situation, suddenly became clear. This guy just said something about the flying sword shadow transformation technique. He even said something about towering scarlet fire, and he even said how could Dawn Rain Continent have such a thing? Could it be that this guy? Moreover, he still has something important to do. What is it? Alas, now that things have come to this young master. Is it still useful to think about these things? Xiao Hua's whole body was suppressed. Not only was his body unable to move, even his meridians could not operate the dragon transformation art. He could not use the Deva body bestowment technique. Even the innate primordial water controlled by the Buddha's Saraira and the flying sword's execution dream and mountain splitter stopped. In an instant, it seemed that everything around Xiao Hua was stagnant. Everything stopped. Everything was quiet. However, in the moment when everything stopped, an extremely mysterious fluctuation came from Xiao Hua's lower dantian, between the male and female inner cores. Between the two thunder cores was a looming shadow. At this time, with the emergence of the fluctuation, it shrank extremely quickly. After shrinking to the limit, it suddenly collapsed. However, right after it collapsed, a powerful suction force suddenly appeared from the point of collapse. This suction force first grabbed the two thunder cores. However, the thunder cores were originally revolving around this point. When they were pulled near the point, they could no longer be absorbed. The thunder from the two thunder cores struck this invisible point. Gotcha! A light purple thing was born from the point of collapse. The suction force went past the thunder cores and very naturally sucked towards the meridians connected to the lower dantian. This suction force was so powerful and mysterious that it contained the power of the heavenly Tao. How could Yu Tong's divine sense and pressure contend against it? The true essence in the meridians instantly flowed and rushed towards the light purple point in the lower dantian, core condensation. Xiao Hua sensed the changes in the true essence within his body, and suddenly came to a realization. He had been looking for an opportunity to condense the core, but he had no clue. In Zhen Qing's experience, she had mentioned the stagnation of the true yuan. However, the stagnation of the true yuan only occurred after the core was condensed. As for the core, there were different theories. When it came to Xiao Hua, all of his cultivation methods had to stop, and all of his Zhen Yuan had to stagnate. In this stillness, he had to create something out of nothing to truly condense his Dan. If someone else were to say this, how could Xiao Hua believe it? His dragon transformation art, his heavenly man-body empowerment technique, and his bone tempering technique were all in operation at all times. How could he possibly stop? It was only when facing a powerful enemy like Yu Tong that he was able to condense his core in a situation even more desperate than a desperate situation, right? This guy is actually condensing his core at this time? Yu Tong couldn't sense the changes in Xiao Hua's body, but when his pressure and divine sense were defeated, he naturally thought of it. Humph, too bad you picked the wrong place. This was the Buddhist Gold Great Array. And you have a late gold core stage opponent in front of you. Yu Tong sneered. Even when he was pregnant, the confinement force could not compare to this, right? At this point, how could he dare to stay here any longer? Glancing at the blade gore that was overflowing with golden light and silvery white color, he tried to sense it but didn't find any special reaction. Immediately, the silvery white brilliance around his body flourished. The real tiger Dharma body roared and immediately disappeared in mid-air. Where do you think you're going? Xiao Hua naturally took advantage of the other's weakness to take his life. How could he let Yu Tong escape? Not bothering to take the Chenli pill, the Buddha's Saraira urged the innate true water to rush towards Yu Tong. However, in his divine sense, Yu Tong had already disappeared. Wherever the true water passed, there was no trace of Yu Tong. That Yu Tong was also amazing. Using the metal escape technique, he left the Buddhist Gold Great Array in a moment. When he sensed the location of Xiao Hua's divine sense, he even ignored the Buddhist Gold Great Array and used the metal escape technique to escape with the help of the Sword Mound's golden nature spiritual energy. After traveling for over 100 miles, Yutong finally revealed himself with a panicked expression on his face. He sensed his divine sense and looked behind him. Powerful hurricanes had been stirred in the air, and at the center of these hurricanes was a tiny virtual spot. As these hurricanes grew stronger, the dot gradually revealed a sparkling silver-white light. As soon as this light dot appeared, it immediately condensed and enlarged, becoming the size of a grain of rice in a moment. Yutong's eyes narrowed, closely staring at these floating crystals. He knew that this was the celestial phenomenon of Xiaohua's advancement. However, when the crystal grew bigger and bigger, growing to the size of a thumb, it did not stop. Chapter 2657. The entire sky was filled with this crystal. The crystal grew to the size of a fist. Even the fist-sized crystal was still surrounded by a huge whirlpool, and the gold-type spiritual energy of heaven and earth was constantly gathering in the whirlpool. The crystal was still growing, and large silver-white crystals gradually condensed, floating in the sky above the sword tomb. The crystals were multi-edged and looked extremely beautiful. At this time, Yutong's expression was even more shocked. However, this large silver-white crystal did not stop condensing and spreading, and it was still extremely stable as it extended into the distance. Which master is this? It's actually. Before he could say actually, he heard a kachov sound of thunder. In the sky more than 100 li above the sword tomb, heavenly lightning flashed that had never appeared before. This is lightning tribulation? Seeing the golden heavenly lightning in the sky, which was completely different from what he usually saw, Yutong's expression changed. It seems to be. It's a demonic beast's. Third gold tribulation? Damn it, this Feng is actually a demonic beast in human form. He even cultivated to the nascent soul stage. Yutong's eyes flashed with understanding, and his body trembled. How could he dare to stay for even half a moment longer? His body swayed, and he fled towards where he went. However, the gold-type spiritual energy of heaven and earth around him was completely condensed, and for a moment, there really was not enough spiritual energy for him to use the gold escape technique. Yutong could only use the flying technique in a panic, and flew out a full 200 li before that sparkling and translucent silver-white crystal gradually disappeared. This kind of advancement power, other than the nascent soul stage. What else could it be? However, he still had some doubts in his heart. First of all, this was extremely likely to be a demonic beast in human form. The nascent soul stage's power was shocking, but it seemed to be different from an ordinary cultivator's nascent soul stage. Especially that pressure. Why was it the same as a golden core stage? In fact, the nascent soul stage did not even appear. Of course, these doubts flashed past. After all, Feng Ying was a demonic beast in human form, and it was probably different from an ordinary cultivator's nascent soul stage. Secondly, within 100 li, it was Xiaohua's divine sense. Why? Xiaohua's method did not chase out? Even if this was the key to conceiving a nascent soul, it was not too difficult to take advantage of the confinement of the heavenly Tao to kill him. Of course, in the end, these doubts turned into joy for Yutong. If it weren't for these mistakes, would he have been able to escape with his life? Actually, it wasn't that Xiaohua didn't want to kill Yutong. After all, Yutong knew his bottom line. He didn't want this person to live on the Dawn Rain continent. However, just as Xiaohua wanted to use the restriction to advance, a tearing pain suddenly appeared in his lower dantian. It was as if his entire dantian was being torn apart. Xiaohua turned pale with fright and hurriedly split his divine sense into a strand of inner vision. When Xiaohua's divine sense sank into his lower dantian, he was so scared that 2 of his 3 souls left his body. He didn't know what to do. How could he still care about killing Yutong? Northeast of where Xiaohua and Ningdan were, LV Ruocheng couldn't restrain her ecstasy. She looked at the other illusory swordsmen who were also surprised. She didn't hide her joy and said loudly, "Fellow swordsmen, the heavens didn't disappoint our brave warriors. Now, it's finally our turn to reap the fruits of victory. Let's go." After saying that, LV Ruocheng took the lead and flew into the distance. Junior sister LV. Ruoling was naturally happy as well. She glanced at the people beside her and shouted as she flew. Although the Dao sex cultivators have already caught up and are about to fall into junior sister's hands, we've lost too many disciples. However, we have lost too many disciples. There are only 70,000 disciples here. Moreover, we are all injured. We may not be able to fight against the cultivators. In your earlier arrangements, I wonder if we've also made arrangements? Don't worry, senior sister Ruoling. LV Ruocheng said proudly, although I've placed you and me in the formation earlier, I've also placed the Skyscraper Sword Sect, the High Wind Sword Sect, and even Valley Master Chi Peng of the Swarm of Macaw's Valley. However, the battle situation has changed, and I've already made some arrangements. Although the power of the sword formation won't be as great as imagined, I guarantee that even without you and me, none of the hundreds of thousands of Dao Sect's cultivators will be able to escape from the Great Square Sword formation. Heh. Zhu Qingye also flew over and said with a smile, I don't wish to kill all of these cultivators. I only wish to kill most of them and avenge sword friend Song Yuan. Also sword friend LV, Mu Ting also suggested, I don't know how powerful the Great Square Sword formation is, but I feel that it's better to leave a barely discernible way out. Otherwise, if the Dao Sect's cultivators go all out and fight with their lives on the line, I'm afraid that we'll suffer even more losses. LV Ruocheng flew on her sword in the air. Her thin lips curled slightly as she sneered, Sword friend Mu is right, but how many of my sword domain's warriors have been killed by the cultivators? I wish I could stab them to death one by one. Moreover, I've put in so much effort to set up the Great Square Sword formation in order to capture all of them in one fell swoop. I'm afraid that it'll be difficult to show mercy now. LV Ruocheng's tone was somewhat sorrowful. Of course, in the end, this sword sect that was destroyed by the three Dao sects did not receive the glory that they deserved. Furthermore, after that great battle, this sword sect disappeared without a trace in the sword domain and never appeared again. Oh. So that's how it is. The group of swordsmen were all enlightened. However, since it was a sword sect that had been destroyed long ago, and it was not an extremely prominent sword sect, how would they know? What this sword wants to talk about is this nameless sword sect. There are so many of them in my sword domain, and there are also many swordsmen who silently died on the battlefield. LV Ruocheng continued, no matter when we are, no matter if we are defeated or victorious, we cannot forget these nameless swordsmen and nameless sects. LV Jianyu. Ruoling suddenly came to a realization and cried out involuntarily, You're talking about the Flying Dragon Sword Sect? This place is what the Dao Sect swordsmen are called, the Dragon Punishing Slope? That's right. I didn't expect senior sister Ruoling to know about this. LV Ruocheng's eyes revealed a trace of surprise. She did not expect Ruoling to know about the Flying Dragon Sword Sect. Sigh, I'm ashamed to say this. Ruoling's face was somewhat miserable. This sword only happened to look through my sect's sword scroll when I was about to come to the battle and accidentally came across it. It's already good that senior sister can see it. LV Ruocheng comforted, in today's sword domain, who would still remember the Flying Dragon Sword Sect? Yes, that's right. Ruoling understood LV Ruocheng's meaning and said loudly, Disciples of the sword domain, about 8,000 years ago, there was a mysterious sword sect in my sword domain, and it was the Flying Dragon Sword Sect. This sword sect's secret Flying Dragon Sword technique, almost every disciple could comprehend the Flying Dragon Sword intent. It was very popular in the sword domain, and for hundreds of years, there was not a single sword sect in the sword domain that could stand shoulder to shoulder with the Flying Dragon Sword Sect. The crowd of swordsmen was completely in an uproar. Almost all of their eyes flashed with disbelief. They seemed to have never heard of such a powerful sword sect. It's just as LV Jianyu said. During that great battle, the Flying Dragon Sword Sect contributed greatly to my sword domain, and killed countless cultivators, including nascent soul cultivators. Ruoling continued, at the same time, at the end of the great battle, the commander of my sword domain decided to set up a sword formation in the sword tomb, preparing to lure the Dao Sect cultivators into the sword formation to surround and annihilate them. However, the news was leaked, and the Dao Sect cultivators rushed into the sword tomb ahead of time. Seeing that the swordsmen had yet to finish setting up the formation, the disciples of the Flying Dragon Sword Sect volunteered to stop the Dao Sect cultivators here, and buy time for the warriors of my sword domain to set up the formation. In the end, even when the last person from the Flying Dragon Sword Sect died, the sword formation was still not set up. We sword cultivators still lost that great battle. LV Ruocheng continued, and in order to commemorate that great victory, the Dao Sect cultivators named this place Dragon Slaying Slope. That's right, the contribution of the Flying Dragon Sword sect was great. Ruling sighed again. Their elites were all killed in the great battle, and the disciples left in the sword domain were not outstanding. And then, seeing that Ruling did not continue, LV Ruocheng sneered. And then the Flying Dragon Sword sect was swallowed up by some sword sects, and disappeared from the sword domain. Indeed, Ruling said in a low voice. When this sword saw this, my heart was also filled with emotions. This kind of sword sect. We, the various sects of the sword domain, should properly protect them. LV Zhenyu, Zhu Qingye frowned. The conditions of my sword domain are terrible. If there is no competition, no fighting, how can warriors be produced? The matter of the Flying Dragon Sword sect is definitely not intentional, sword friend mentioning it now. He, what Zhu Zhenyu said is reasonable. LV Ruocheng laughed. The survival of the fittest, this is the axiom of my sword domain. This sword once again said that this time, I do not have any intention of blaming any swordsman, or any sword sect. This sword only wants to let you sword friends know that my sword domain has countless such swordsmen, countless such sword sects. We cannot forget them at any time. As long as we have their spirit with their actions, why should we worry about not being able to take down the Dao sect? Why should we worry about not being able to defeat the sword tomb? Yes, we understand. All the swordsmen said in unison. Good. LV Ruocheng pointed again and said, since the beginning of the Dao Cultivator War, this sword has been planning to set up a killing sword formation at the dragon-slaying slope where the Flying Dragon Sword sect swordsmen died, and kill the hundreds of thousands of Dao sect cultivators one by one. Now this sword's wish is finally half completed. Those stupid Jurassic beast cultivators have indeed caught up. Right now, we are at the center of the great square sword formation that this sword has set up. And within a radius of 10 miles, is the first great formation of the great square sword formation, the Yinyang sword formation. Then, LV Ruocheng pointed outside and said, outside the Yinyang sword formation is the second great formation, the 5-element splitting edge sword formation. Further outside is the third great formation, the spirit devouring formation. As for the outermost layer, it is a mysterious formation. This sword has not thought of a good name for it, but I believe that after today's killing, this great formation will have an extremely resounding name tomorrow. Chapter 2660. Kill. Xiong Song said without hesitation, I don't believe that a sword cultivator can silently set up another sword formation outside my 10-direction annihilation formation. If that's the case, wouldn't it be the biggest joke in the world? Yes, Xiong Song didn't dare to believe it. Although this place was only 100 miles away from the 10-direction annihilation formation, if a sword cultivator made any movements here and set up a sword formation that could take down hundreds of thousands of cultivators, how could he not know? That's right, this is the empty city plan. In an instant, Hung Hang also made a decision and waved his hand. Disciples? Kill! Kill! When the disciples around Hang Hang heard the order, they all shouted in unison. This sound spread out and spread in waves. Close to 100,000 cultivators were shouting loudly, and the momentum was very threatening. Then, some of the hesitant cultivators once again increased their flying speed. However, even when they flew to the front of the dragon-punishing slope and pushed under the phoenix sword intent, they still didn't see any traces of the swordsman. Moreover, in the distance, it was also pitch black, without a trace of sword brilliance. In addition, at this moment, it was the darkness before dawn. The previous trace of light had already disappeared, and the entire world was exceptionally dark. However, the torrential rain from before gradually lessened at this moment, and the rain began to fall intermittently. Hung Hang and the other golden core cultivators were also cautious at this time. First, they stopped the group of cultivators from advancing, and sent 100 or so Foundation Establishment late-stage disciples to fly forward to explore the path. Then, Gao Wei, Xiong Song, and the others waved their hands and took out their magic treasures. Their figures flew straight into the sky, as if they wanted to explore the meaning of this huge phoenix. Hung Hang and the others looked at the figures of Xiong Song and the others while releasing their divine senses to carefully explore this extremely ordinary-looking slope. Boom! A loud sound rang out. Before Gao Wei and Xiong Song could fly close to this huge phoenix, the phoenix let out a deafening sound and turned into thousands of green sword lights, flying in all directions, clearly illuminating the surrounding several miles. Hundreds of thousands of Dao sect disciples formed a black mass within a radius of a couple of miles. They formed a spindle shape. Most of them were gathered near the dragon-punishing slope. There were quite a number of them extending forward in front of them. Behind them, there were over 10,000 people who remained at the same spot. They appeared to be very cautious. The green sword brilliance only shone for an instant, and in the next moment, the entire dragon-slaying slope fell into darkness. Fellow Taoist Hang Ming, De Sun frowned and said, "This matter is rather strange. We need to be careful. In this old man's opinion, why don't you stop while you're ahead?" Fellow Taoist De Sun. Ji Hong was a little unhappy. Just as she was about to say something, she suddenly heard a rumbling sound within 10 li of the dragon-punishing slope. The ground shook violently. Not good. Flying high in the sky, Gao Wei, who had just landed, immediately panicked and said anxiously, "Let's go quickly. I'm afraid we've fallen into a sword cultivator's ambush." "Shut up." When Hang Ming heard this, he roared angrily, "Disciples, listen to my command. Form the usual defensive formation." Yes, when the group of disciples first heard Gao Wei's words, they were very flustered and almost wanted to scatter and flee. However, when they heard Hang Ming's words, they suppressed the fear in their hearts. Each small team formed a formation, each sect formed a formation, and in a moment, everything stabilized. Gao Wei was humiliated in front of everyone. His face was burning, but he did not even have the courage to glare at Hang Ming. Because his shout just now was indeed too abrupt. Rumble. The earth shaking did not stop. Instead, wave after wave, it became more and more intense. Even at the place where the thousands of green sword brilliance disappeared, faint sword brilliance gradually emerged from the darkness and flashed from the horizon. This. Although Xiong Huasong did not land, his voice could be heard. He was almost in disbelief and shock. How is this possible? We've actually fallen into a sword cultivator's ambush? Xiong Huasong was not the only one who did not dare to believe it. All the golden core cultivators in the meeting hall did not dare to believe it. The changes in this battle were too unpredictable. Even in their wildest dreams, they did not expect that the swordsmen who were about to be killed by them would actually set up such a huge sword formation when they were in a desperate situation. They had opened their pockets and were waiting for them to come in. Moreover, what puzzled the hundreds of thousands of cultivators was that they had really come in. This must be a trick to mislead the troops. Ji Hong shouted without hesitation. Lu Ruochong has less than 70,000 swordsmen under his command. How can they surround hundreds of thousands of cultivators? How can they set up such a huge sword formation? However, at this point, this female cultivator who was incomparably touched by Qian Mo's words suddenly had a brilliant flash of light in her mind, like all the other golden core cultivators. Ji Hong was dumbfounded. While Hang Lu was shocked, he coldly glanced at Ji Hong and said indifferently, "Taoist Ji Hong, did you see that? I have already said that we shouldn't pursue a cornered enemy, but for the sake of Taoist Qian Mo's blood feud, we still chased after them." Ji Hong heard the reproach in Hang Lu's tone. How could she not understand what he meant? Just as she was about to retort, she heard Hang Ju's tone change. She wasn't a fool, so she gritted her teeth and said, "That's right, this old one also knows not to pursue a cornered enemy. At that time, if we had stopped, even if these sword cultivators had laid down this sword array, they definitely wouldn't have been able to succeed. But if we didn't chase after them, how could we face our own conscience? How could we face Qian Mo, Li Chengxiu, and the other Taoists who died?" When Hang Lu heard this, his heart was slightly relieved. However, De Sun's face was heavy as he said, "Fellow Taoists, don't blame yourselves. Previously, I felt that the end of this battle was a little strange and couldn't figure out where the sword cultivators had gone. It was impossible that there were only the hundreds of thousands of disciples led by LV Ruochong and the others. Now, their true purpose has been revealed. A portion of their disciples were setting up the sword formation in the sword tomb. They had set up an ambush here and were waiting to lure us in. From the looks of it, even if we don't take the bait this time, they will still have other ways to lure us in." Gao Wei hurriedly said, "This plan. I'm afraid that it had already started when we agreed on the 10-direction annihilation grand formation?" "That's right," Xiong Huasong nodded and said. "And this old man is sure that this sword formation must have been set before the 10-direction annihilation grand formation. Otherwise, this old man would have known about it." Hang Lu nodded. Daoist Xiong's words are reasonable. Moreover, Daoist Xiong's grand formation did not attract the attention of the sword cultivators. It is indeed Daoist Xiong's great merit. It's nothing. Xiong Huasong was secretly proud and at the same time, he said humbly, Daoist Qian Mo's thoughts are actually the same as the sword cultivators. He is even more powerful. That's right, that's why we have to avenge him at all costs. Hung Lu hurriedly added. I'm afraid this is not the time to shirk responsibility. Li Jijie of the Chongbai sect saw that the many golden core cultivators were actually not in a hurry to set up the formation, and instead talked about the reason for the ambush. He couldn't help but say coldly, wait until we kill our way out of the sword formation, then it won't be too late to talk about other things. Hung Lu's face was slightly embarrassed, but he didn't care about Li Jijie's cold words. If he didn't explain clearly the responsibility of chasing and attacking, everyone would come to an agreement in their hearts. Even if he could lead the disciples of the Utopia faction to break out of the encirclement safely, he wouldn't feel at ease. Humph. The sword cultivators only have 70,000 people. They fell into our grand formation first and lost more than half of them. This so-called ambush and sword formation, I'm afraid it won't be intact. Ji Hong spoke again. We only need to set up the formation to deal with them. Do you think we're afraid of them? Xiang Ming of the Huanhua sect stood far away and didn't get too close. At this moment, he also opened his mouth and said, that's right, our Dao sect cultivators have more than 100,000 people. Just like the sword cultivators breaking through the formation, they are charging in the same direction. How can they not break out of the sword formation? At this moment, a figure flew over and stopped in front of Hung Lu. It was Li Zongbao who had just flown back to check out the situation. Zongbao, what's the situation? Hung Lu raised his eyebrows and asked anxiously. Reporting to Master, Senior Uncles and Senior Uncles. Li Zongbao bowed and said, the large group of people who came to kill the sword cultivators has been divided into two parts by the sword formation. The sword formation is green and red in color and is gradually taking shape. See. Hung Lu and the others' divine senses couldn't go very far, but they could see it clearly with their naked eyes. They couldn't help but gasp. Setting up a sword formation in such a large area, not to mention its power, the scale was probably much larger than the 10-direction annihilation formation. Chapter 2661. Hung Heng even looked at Xiong Huasong. After all, this sword formation was so close to the magic formation. How could Xiong Huasong not notice it? Xiong Huasong's face was also extremely ugly. This was really a slap to his face. Although the sword catacomb was incomparably dangerous and one's divine sense couldn't travel very far, but this was still a huge sword formation. It was right next to his magic formation. How could he not notice it? Could it be? Xiong Huasong suddenly had an idea in his mind. However, just as he was about to speak, there was a continuous rumbling sound. The vibration surrounding the dragon-slaying slope intensified and spread extremely quickly. It had already rushed to the feet of the hundreds of thousands of cultivators and reached the vicinity of the dragon-slaying slope. All disciples, pay attention. Hung Ming said loudly, activate your magic power and advance towards where you came from. Boom. A huge sword cry directly suppressed Hung Heng's voice. At the place where the dragon-slaying slope was located, the ground of about 10 zhang had completely collapsed. Two sword lights that were thicker than pillars rushed into the sky. That biting cold sword qi and soaring sword light immediately illuminated the area within dozens of li in a green and red color. These two sword lights, one crimson red and the other azure, were like pillars that reached the sky, piercing straight into the sky. Ha ha ha, welcome, welcome. From within the sword pillar, a loud and clear voice sounded. When the cultivators raised their heads to look, they saw that from within the crimson sword pillar, a red-faced, muscular middle-aged swordsman wearing a red sword robe appeared, holding a similarly crimson flying sword in his hand. Who are you? Hung Heng looked at this unfamiliar swordsman and coldly said, ha. That swordsman was still laughing. He took a step forward and flew out from the sword pillar, saying, this sword is the Supreme Harmony Sword Zongyang Joding. A nobody. Looking at this second-grade illusory swordsman, Li Jijie coldly said, Hee, if senior brother Yang is a nobody, then there is no need to talk about this sword. A laughter that sounded like a silver bell came from the azure sword formation. Following the flickering of a sword light, another petite and beautiful female swordsman wearing an azure sword formation flew out from the sword pillar. Junior sister Xiao. The corners of young Jiuding's mouth curled into a smile as he said, "The cultivators of the Dao sect have always been arrogant, and they look down on us swordsmen, not to mention us second-rate sword sects in the sword domain. However, they don't know any better, so we have to be polite. Junior sister, if you don't tell us your name, wouldn't they have died an unjust death when we kill them?" Senior Martial Brother Yang's words make sense. The female swordsman chuckled and said, "I am Xueqi of the Kuan sword sect. I'll be waiting for you. Don't forget my name when you reach the underworld." "How dare you?" Li Jijie scolded, "You're just 2 grade 2 illusory swordsmen, yet you dare to brag here." "Senior Martial Brother, let me take their heads." The 4 cultivators beside Li Jijie looked at each other and said in unison, "Okay." Li Jijie nodded slightly when he saw that they were 4 disciples of the early stage of the Golden Core realm. When the 4 disciples saw that Li Jijie was doing the same, they waved their hands, and the flying swords in their hands flashed with brilliance. They flew up and flew towards Yang Jiuding and Xueqi, who were leaning against the green and red sword pillars. The 4 of them had just flown a few feet when the brilliance around them flashed. 4 rays of sword light flashed with 4 colors. The sword chi rushed out of the flying swords and slightly intertwined in the air. It seemed that there was a strange connection between the 4 rays of sword light. The sword light began to rotate. When the 4 saw this, they shouted in unison, "Quick!" Immediately after, the flying swords in their hands shot out. Each hand formed a sword seal, and the 4 flying swords suddenly accelerated like shooting stars piercing the sun. The 4 flying swords gave birth to 4 different forces. These forces were not only extremely sharp, but they also cooperated with each other, trapping Yang Jiuding and Xueqi in an area of dozens of feet. As expected of the disciples of the Changbai sect. They actually used the Dharma array technique on their flying swords. Yang Jiuding sneered. However, Dharma arrays are all Dharma arrays. The flying swords inside are just Dharma artifacts. How can they compare to the sword array of us swordsmen? As he spoke, Yang Jiuding waved his hand very casually. It was like a fountain sprinkling a few drops of spring water. Several crimson sword lights pierced towards the 4 flying swords. However, when the crimson sword lights pierced a few feet in front of the flying swords, the 4 flying swords suddenly trembled and suddenly changed directions, stabbing towards Xueqi. Xueqi was originally smiling as he watched Yang Jiuding deal with the 4 flying swords. However, when the 4 flying swords changed directions, the crimson sword beams missed. Xueqi couldn't help but raise his eyebrows. Seeing the 4 flying swords close in on him, he also pointed with his finger. Several azure sword beams flew out from the azure sword pillar to meet the 4 flying swords. Under the control of the 4 early-stage golden core cultivators, the 4 flying swords turned into 4 streams of light and fiercely pierced towards the green sword lights that looked like thin threads. Just as the azure sword light was about to collide with the 4 streaks of light, the several azure sword lights twirled slightly and turned into a dozen streaks of light. At the same time, the crimson sword light that had missed its target suddenly changed direction and pierced towards the 4 streaks of light at a speed several hundred times faster than before. Crack, 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 crack. 4 crisp sounds could be heard as dozens of green-red sword silk circled around the 4 flying swords. These 4 flying swords of extraordinary quality were immediately sliced in half. Not good. The 4 flying swords were easily destroyed and the 4 early-stage golden core cultivators' minds were seriously injured. They didn't dare to attack anymore and turned around to fly back. "Where do you think you're going?" Yang Jiuding shouted and pointed with his hand. A dozen rays of crimson sword lights fell from the sky and pierced towards the 4. Xueqi also controlled the green sword lights. A dozen rays of light circled around each other and pierced towards the 4 people like lightning. The 4 people were shocked and their souls almost flew out of their bodies. "Humph!" Li Jijie snorted coldly in mid-air. The flying sword in his hand flew out and turned into a golden light. It rushed towards the green and red sword lights like a coiling dragon. Good timing. Seeing Li Jijie's sword light surpass the 4 people and was about to hit the green and red sword light, another low voice came from the sword pillar. A short old man with a face full of wrinkles flew out from the sword pillar. This old man's body flashed with the same green and red brilliance. He waved his hand and punched the flying sword. The old man appeared so suddenly that Li Jijie didn't have time to react. With a pung sound, Li Jijie's flying sword was hit by the old man's fist. The flying sword emitted a "G-ape" sound and flew down diagonally. Not good. When Li Jijie's flying sword was hit, his mind was also shaken. However, when he controlled the flying sword, his gaze fell on the dozen rays of light piercing towards him. Sure enough, without waiting for the dozen or so cyan-red sword lights to descend, the four of them clapped their hands together and 4 magic treasures flew out from their storage pouches. They were actually 4 identical shield-type defensive magic treasures. The 4 defensive magic treasures suddenly enlarged under the urging of the 4 people's magic power. They were now several feet in size and emitted a green-colored brilliance. This brilliance was extremely bright and protected the 4 people's bodies tightly. Moreover, it was very obvious that the brilliance of these 4 magic treasures lingered around each other and the fluctuations of spiritual power were also linked. It was just like they were used to cooperating. However, when the dozen rays of light fell on the green brilliance of the magic treasures, they immediately intertwined. The green brilliance also shook violently and fought with the sword light. However, what shocked the 4 people was that this sword light was extremely different from the sword light they had encountered before. In the fight, it actually avoided the important part and focused on the trivial. It was like a strange tentacle that wandered around, as if it was looking for the weakness of the magic treasures. Hee. While the 4 people activated their magic treasures to defend, they quickly descended. However, at this moment, they heard Xueqi's sneer in their ears. The 4 people felt a chill in their hearts. Sure enough, following the sneer, a thin green sword light pierced into the gap between the 2 magic treasures that appeared in an instant. At the same time, another thin crimson sword radiance appeared along with the azure sword radiance in an even more bizarre manner. Fight! The heart of the golden core disciple closest to the 2 sword lights tightened. With a flick of his hand, several rays of spiritual power appeared and a series of seals appeared to block the sword lights. Since Li Jijie and the other golden core cultivators were shocked, how could the hundreds of thousands of foundation establishment and chi refinement cultivators not be scared?